The Atlantic Ocean has carried many stories, but few shaped the world as deeply as those that unfolded during the U-boat war. For anyone who lived through the 1,940 seconds or grew up hearing the voices of parents and grandparents who did this, chapter of history is not distant. It is familiar, heavy, and still lined with unanswered questions. Tonight, we return to those waters, not with drama, but with clarity, not to sensationalize, but to understand. During the Second World War, German U-boats prowled the Atlantic in long, tense patrols, challenging the very lifelines that kept Britain alive. These submarines were small, cramped, and unforgiving. Their crews were often barely out of adolescence, yet they carried responsibilities that would shake even seasoned sailors. Across the ocean, merchant seamen, naval escorts, and air crews faced them in a struggle that stretched across years and continents. This is a story of technology, strategy, and relentless endurance, but also of humanity. The fear of depth charges, the loneliness of long patrols, the courage of convoy sailors, the quiet moments between battles, when both sides listened to the same ocean. Let us return to that vast, cold battleground and trace the lives shaped by it. You are listening to Lullaby of Empires, the birth of the U-boat idea. Long before the U-boats became a familiar shadow on the wartime Atlantic, the story of Germany's submarine arm began in small, quiet rooms, where memories of one war still echoed and the shape of another slowly gathered. It began not with steel or engines, but with reflection, the kind that settles over a nation after defeat. In 1918, when the First World War ended, Germany's submariners walked away from their boats knowing they had written a new, unsettling chapter in naval warfare. They had come close to breaking Britain's supply lines. They had proven the potential of a weapon most navies still regarded as experimental, and they had watched their entire fleet be dismantled by the terms of a treaty that intended to keep such danger buried forever. Yet ideas do not dismantle as easily as ships. Knowledge does not dissolve, because peace demands it. And the men who had served in those early U-boats, men who had seen both their strengths and their shortcomings, carried those lessons quietly into the years that followed. Among them was a young officer named Karl Donitz, who survived the sinking of his own submarine and spent time as a prisoner of war. Those experiences left a mark on him, not of bitterness, but of intense contemplation. He had seen what a single submarine could accomplish, and he had also seen how alone it was once detected. He understood that the concept needed refining, cooperation, and discipline if it were ever to reach its full potential. When Germany entered the interwar years under strict restrictions, it appeared to the world that the U-boat threat was gone for good. The Treaty of Versailles prohibited the construction, possession, or even the study of submarines. Shipyards went quiet. Designs were locked away. Naval planners were forced into other roles. But as often happens in history, nations adapt around what is forbidden. Engineers found work in foreign shipyards, designing submarines for other countries. German officers traveled to nations willing to share their vessels for training. Naval thinkers wrote theories on underwater warfare under different names, circulating ideas without revealing their true purpose. It was a strange time, a period where official silence hid a quiet, persistent current of thought. While Europe tried to rebuild its economies and repair its societies, Germany's naval professionals maintained a thin, fragile thread of submarine expertise. They studied the old war analytically. They examined why early torpedoes failed. They explored how British convoys adapted. They debated the potential of coordinated submarine operations. These were not the ambitions of a remilitarized Germany, but the intellectual momentum of a community that could not forget what it had learned beneath the waves. As the 1,920 seconds became the 1,930 seconds, the political landscape shifted. Germany's new leadership rejected the constraints of Versailles and sought to rebuild its armed forces openly. It was in this environment that Karl Donitz finally found space to develop the idea that had lived in his mind since his days as a prisoner. The idea of coordinated U-boats operating together, not as lone predators, but as a united force. He believed that submarines should not wander independently across the Atlantic, hoping to find isolated ships. Instead, they should patrol in wide lines, spaced far apart, covering enormous stretches of ocean. When one spotted a convoy, it would not attack immediately. It would shadow the formation and signal the others. Only when enough U-boats had silently gathered would the attack begin swift, overwhelming, and from multiple directions. What Donitz envisioned was not unlike the behavior of wolves, each one alert, each one part of a collective effort that became far stronger than any single hunter. The ocean was vast. Only cooperation could command it. This simple, almost intuitive idea that submarines could attack as a group would eventually reshape the entire war at sea. But at the time, it existed mostly on paper, a theory awaiting the right combination of boats, crews, and circumstances. Germany's rearmament allowed the first steps toward making this concept real. Early submarines were small training boats, more than operational weapons, but they served their purpose. Crews learned how to dive quickly, how to navigate submerged, how to maintain engines in tight quarters, and how to endure the long, cramped existence that life in a submarine demanded. Each patrol in the Baltic Sea provided lessons, both technical and human. The officers absorbed every detail with an eye toward the future, the young sailors with a mixture of excitement and unease. These men were the first generation of a new U-boat arm, though they did not yet know the scale of what awaited them. Shipyards slowly expanded their capabilities. The German Navy introduced new classes of submarines, most importantly, the Type 7, a boat that would become as iconic to underwater warfare as the Spitfire was to air combat. It was fast enough to strike, maneuverable enough to evade, and simple enough to be produced in large numbers. It was, in many ways, the perfect expression of Donitz's tactical ideas. But what mattered even more than the vessels themselves were the crews who learned to operate them. Submarine life required discipline, resilience, trust, and a deliberate calm that did not break under pressure or isolation. The training forged such qualities steadily. In those pre-war years, U-boat crews lived in a world suspended between preparation and expectation. They knew what had happened in the last conflict. They understood the risks. They were aware of the debate among naval theorists about the ethics and effectiveness of submarine warfare. But they also believed that if another war came, and by the late 1932, that possibility seemed more like a certainty, they would be part of the first line of offense. Germany lacked a surface fleet capable of challenging Britain head-on. Submarines were the alternative, the weapon that could strike where battleships could not reach. As Europe edged toward war once again, the seeds planted in the years after Versailles stood ready to grow. Donitz had his doctrine. Germany had its boats. The crews had their training. The ocean, cold and indifferent, awaited what history would ask of it. When the first U-boat received its wartime orders in September 1939, many of the men aboard were still little more than boys. They tightened sea valves, checked torpedoes, and took their places at their bunks and stations with the knowledge that everything ahead of them would be unpredictable. And yet, they sailed with purpose, not driven by ideology alone, but by the weight of duty, the belief that they were stepping into a chapter of history shaped by forces far larger than themselves. The U-boat story did not begin with torpedoes or with fear, nor with the dramatic headlines that would later fill newspapers. It began with reflection, with ideas carried quietly through years of prohibition, with a doctrine built from observation and memory. It began with men who believed they understood the demands of the deep and were prepared to answer them once more. And as those first submarines slipped into the North Sea under gray September skies, the world did not yet know how profoundly they would influence the years ahead. Karl Donitz and the Wolfpack concept. For many who lived through the early 20th century, leadership often came from men shaped not in classrooms or conferences, but in the hard, unforgiving experiences of war. Karl Donitz was one of those men. His legacy today is complicated, surrounded by the shadows of the regime he ultimately served. Yet, the role he played in the development of U-boat strategy cannot be separated from the realities of the time. His impact on the war at sea came not from politics, but from a long, difficult journey that began decades earlier, when he was a young officer studying the rhythms of underwater warfare. Donitz entered the First World War as a naval man with ambition and technical skill, but the war transformed him. His own submarine was sunk in 1918, and he spent the final months as a prisoner of war in Malta, an experience that stripped him of rank, comfort, and control, leaving behind only time to think. And in that quiet space, surrounded by uncertainty, he began to examine what submarines had accomplished and what they had failed to do. He replayed the missions he had been part of. He reviewed reports. He studied the patterns of merchant shipping and British countermeasures. He recognized, perhaps more clearly than most, that the submarine had not yet reached its full potential. What troubled him most was not the danger of underwater warfare, though that was immense, but the inefficiency of sending lone submarines into a vast ocean. Each boat operated like a solitary hunter, relying on luck to locate scattered ships. When a submarine did find a convoy, it faced a difficult choice: attack alone and risk quick retaliation, or shadow the convoy and risk losing it altogether. There was no system binding the U-boats together, no unified approach. It was a force with skill and bravery, but not coherence. Donitz's time in captivity gave him clarity. If submarines were to become truly decisive weapons, they would need to operate not as isolated vessels, but as coordinated units. He envisioned a future where U-boats would communicate more efficiently, respond to sightings swiftly, and attack with timing rather than chance. He imagined a commander in a distant headquarters, directing these boats like pieces on a chessboard, forming and reforming lines, concentrating force where it mattered most. He believed this was not just an improvement, it was the missing piece. When he returned to Germany after the war, the Navy was in ruins, and the submarine arm prohibited entirely. But Donitz carried his idea like a lantern. Through the long, difficult years of restricted military activity, he refined the concept, watching technology evolve and waiting for the moment when such a doctrine might be needed again. When Germany began rearming, Donitz was given a role in shaping the new U-boat force, and with that opportunity came the chance to test his theory. He saw in the new generation of submarines not only weapons, but tools of coordination. Radio technology had advanced since 1918. Boats could now send short, encrypted messages quickly. The improved ranges of these radios meant that they could report the position of enemy convoys across great distances, and under the right system, each message could be used to direct other submarines toward a common target. This was the foundation of what he called Rudeltaktik, the Wolfpack tactic. But the concept required discipline and trust. A submarine that spotted a convoy had to resist the instinct to strike immediately. Instead, it needed to shadow the enemy, staying close but hidden, reporting the convoy's course constantly. Meanwhile, other boats scattered across the ocean would receive those reports and converge silently. Hours might pass, sometimes an entire day, but when the attack finally came, it would be sudden and devastating, overwhelming a convoy's escorts and scattering its ships. This was not a lone hunter's strike. It was the coordinated effort of many. Donitz believed the success of this tactic would hinge not only on technology, but on people, on the captains who understood their roles, the radio operators who maintained discipline, and the crews who trusted the system even when instinct pushed them toward immediate action. For this reason, training emphasized more than technical skill. It emphasized understanding. Officers were taught the broader strategy, not just the task of their own vessel. They were trained to see themselves as part of something larger, as pieces of a complex but powerful design. The German Navy's leadership understood Donitz's vision, but not all embraced it fully. Some admired the boldness of surface fleets. Others believed aircraft would become the dominant force. Yet, as the European situation deteriorated in the late 1930s, it became clear that Germany's surface fleet would not be strong enough to challenge Britain's Royal Navy directly. Battleships like Bismarck had symbolic value, but not enough to change the strategic balance. The submarine force, on the other hand, offered a path that did not require size or grandeur, only persistence, coordination, and stealth. It was a weapon suited to asymmetry, and in Donitz's mind, one suited to decide the war at sea. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, bringing Britain and France into the war, the U-boat arm was still too small to implement the full Wolfpack concept. Only a handful of submarines were operational, and many of those were short-range boats unsuitable for the wide Atlantic. But Donitz pushed for every improvement he could. He had his headquarters at Carnival near Lorient, prepared for centralized communication. He streamlined reporting procedures. He secured commitments for greater U-boat production. And he watched the early patrols closely, adjusting tactics whenever a weakness appeared. The war, in its brutal logic, accelerated the development of everything: technology, leadership, urgency, and as the U-boats began to see more action, Donitz's ideas were tested and refined. Early operations revealed the importance of timing. Others revealed gaps in communication. A few showed the value of using the surface at night for speed. Every patrol became a lesson. Every lesson, a step toward the full realization of the Wolfpack strategy. It is important to understand that Donitz himself was not a fanatic ideologue in shaping U-boat doctrine. He was a naval thinker above all else, operating within a regime whose broader policies and actions would define history, but whose underwater strategies came from a lifetime of experience rather than ideology. His focus was technical and tactical. His motivations were bound to a belief in naval warfare, shaped by his own memories of hardship and loss. By 1940, as Germany swept across Western Europe and claimed ports along the Atlantic coast, Donitz finally had the tools to bring his concept fully to life. The U-boats were closer to the shipping lanes. The fleet was growing. Radio procedures had been tightened, and the crews, hardened by early patrols, were ready to take part in something larger than isolated missions. The Wolfpack doctrine, once a theory developed in the quiet of captivity, was now ready to shape the most consequential naval campaign of the war. And so, the stage was set. The Atlantic, wide and cold, lay before them. The convoys would come, the U-boats would gather, and Donitz's idea, born from reflection, sharpened by necessity, and carried forward by the discipline of countless young men, would soon enter the pages of history. When the first successful coordinated attacks took place, the world began to understand the magnitude of what had been unleashed. But that part of the story belongs to the next chapter, when theory met reality in the dark waters of the open sea. Germany rearms, building the new U-boat fleet. When Germany began to step away from the restrictions of the 1922, it did not do so with sudden declarations or loud demonstrations. It happened quietly at first, with small decisions that seemed harmless, technical, or administrative. A naval school reopened here. A research office reorganized there. Training manuals appeared that resembled civilian engineering texts, but contained unmistakable hints of future military use. And in the background, the memory of the last Great War shaped every choice made by the men who had served through it. For the submarine community, the interwar period had been a strange exile. Their boats were gone, their bases dismantled, and their doctrines buried under the terms of Versailles. But their knowledge remained intact, alive in the minds of officers who had seen firsthand what underwater warfare could accomplish. They watched the world change through the 1930s 920 seconds, and early 1,930 seconds, waiting for permission or perhaps inevitability to return to the deep. And when Germany's political climate shifted dramatically with the rise of the National Socialist regime, rearmament no longer hid in the shadows. It became a central pillar of national ambition. The Navy moved quickly. By the mid-1930 seconds, Germany withdrew from the clauses that had banned submarine construction, announcing to the world that its fleet would rise again. But the truth was that preparations had begun long before that moment. Engineers had been designing submarine components under foreign contracts. German officers had been serving as technical advisors in countries that did not fear the scrutiny of Allied inspectors. And naval planners, always cautious and meticulous, had preserved technical data from the First World War that would soon become the foundation of an entirely new submarine fleet. The earliest boats Germany produced in this new era were small coastal submarines, the Type II class. They were not designed for long ocean patrols. They lacked the torpedo load and range required for major operations, but they were perfect for what Germany needed most at that moment: training. These compact submarines allowed young crews to learn the fundamentals of Auffahrtszeit, diving, surfacing, trimming ballast, handling torpedoes, and navigating underwater with precision. They were the first classrooms of the new U-boat arm. Inside a Type II submarine, the close quarters left very little room for error. Everything creaked. Everything pressed inward. New recruits learned immediately what life would be: oily air, damp uniforms, constant noise, and a strict routine that tolerated no carelessness. Officers taught their men how to listen to the hull, how to sense the balance of the boat by feel alone, how to detect the faintest changes in the rhythm of machinery. They practiced emergency dives, surfacing drills, and torpedo loading until every motion became instinct. In these early years, the crews developed the discipline, patience, and teamwork that would later define the Wolfpack campaigns. While these young sailors were learning their craft, German shipyards were preparing for something far more ambitious. The designers studied every submarine built during the First World War, comparing strengths and weaknesses. They examined foreign vessels. They incorporated advances in battery technology, hull design, and diesel engines. Out of this blend of experience and innovation came the Type 7, the boat that would become the backbone of Germany's wartime fleet. The Type 7 was not a large submarine by modern standards, but it struck the perfect balance between speed, maneuverability, and offensive power. Its range was sufficient to reach the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic. Its engines were reliable. Its torpedoes could be loaded quickly. And most important of all, it was simple enough to be produced in large numbers, a crucial factor in the industrial race that would soon define the war. The German Navy placed enormous emphasis on quality during these early years. Each submarine was inspected meticulously. Components were tested again and again. Even the smallest details, valves, wiring, pressure seals, went through rigorous evaluation. Germany's rearmament program understood that a submarine was only as strong as its weakest link. A faulty pump or a cracked weld could doom an entire crew miles below the surface. And so the builders approached their work with the seriousness of men who knew what was at stake. Alongside the construction of new boats came the building of new bases. Ports along the Baltic Sea came alive with activity. Docks that had spent years in disrepair were strengthened and expanded. Warehouses filled with spare parts, fuel, and specialized equipment. As tensions in Europe grew, Germany also began preparing Atlantic ports in the event that military fortunes shifted in its favor. These early preparations were not yet aggressive, but they were unmistakably deliberate. Within the Navy, a new culture formed not of celebration or bravado, but of professionalism. Officers who had served in the First World War guided younger men with a mixture of sternness and responsibility. They remembered the dangers of underwater service. They understood the mistakes made in the previous conflict. And they knew that the next war, should it come, would be larger and more complex than anything they had experienced before. Their teaching reflected that awareness. The crews were trained not merely to operate a submarine, but to survive inside one. In these years, Donitz's influence grew steadily. He spoke often of the need for coordination, for disciplined communication, and for a fleet built not on individual achievements, but on unified purpose. His ideas spread through training programs, officer schools, and tactical exercises. Even the youngest cadets learned that the success of their submarine would depend not only on their own skill, but on the skill of every boat around them. It was a mindset that transformed the U-boat arm from a collection of vessels into something approaching a single organism. Every patrol in the Baltic tested this philosophy. Submarines practiced traveling in loose formations, maintaining radio silence unless essential, sharing sightings in brief, encrypted messages, and simulating attacks against escorted convoys. These exercises were not perfect replicas of what awaited in the Atlantic, but they sharpened instincts and strengthened bonds between commanders, who would later depend on one another in the open ocean. As 1938 drew to a close, the sense of preparation intensified. Germany's political moves, the annexations, the diplomatic pressures, the growing tension with Britain and France made it clear that war was not a matter of if, but when. In naval headquarters, orders were reviewed with increasing urgency. Crews spent longer hours training. Boats underwent final modifications. Shipyards worked around the clock. The U-boat arm was not yet ready for a full assault against the Allied powers, but it was far more prepared than its opponents realized. Yet, even with growing confidence, the mood among the seasoned submariners was not one of excitement. Older men, the veterans of the First World War, remembered too clearly the losses suffered in the final stages of that conflict. They warned their younger comrades of the dangers they would face: the claustrophobia, the isolation, the suddenness with which a submarine could go from predator to prey. For many sailors, the thought of war brought a feeling not of adventure, but of gravity. They knew their futures might rest in steel hulls diving through dark waters, trusting both their machines and their companions with their lives. But they also believed in their preparation. They believed in their boats. They believed in their training. And they believed that if called to war, they would be fighting with an advantage that had been built through years of patient, deliberate effort. By the final days of August 1939, the U-boat arm was as ready as it would ever be. Crews waited beside their submarines, their duffel bags packed, their letters, home written. The shipyards fell quiet, except for final checks. Officers reviewed charts of the North Atlantic, marking patrol zones and potential convoy routes, and throughout Germany, families prepared to say goodbye once more. When the orders came, the men boarded their boats with steady steps. There was no celebration, no cheering, only the sound of diesel engines turning over, and the low hum of anticipation running beneath the surface of every thought. The U-boat fleet, rebuilt from the ashes of the past, was now heading toward the war that would define it. And as those boats slipped away from the coast, the sailors could not have known just how deep into history their journey would take them. Opening moves. The first months of the war. When the war finally began in September 1939, the men of the U-boat arm stepped into it with a sense of purpose sharpened by years of preparation, but also with the quiet acknowledgement that the future was uncertain. No amount of training could completely prepare a crew for the first wartime patrol, for the moment when a submarine slipped into hostile waters, knowing that behind every calm horizon, danger waited. For many sailors, the beginning was almost surreal. They had spent months, even years, drilling the routines, memorizing procedures, and learning to respond to every alarm as if it were real. But the atmosphere of wartime patrols carried something different, a seriousness that pressed against every surface of the submarine. Letters home were shorter, jokes were fewer. Even the diesel engines seemed to sound different as the boats left their bases, pushing out toward the North Sea with a sense of inevitability. The early missions revealed both strengths and weaknesses of Germany's reawakened submarine force. On paper, the fleet was small. Many boats were still completing sea trials. Some crews lacked experience. The Navy leadership knew they were entering the conflict with far fewer submarines than the First World War had ended with. Donitz had hoped for at least 300 U-boats to begin a full-scale campaign against Britain's supply lines. Instead, he had fewer than 60 operational boats when war broke out, and only a fraction of those were capable of long-range patrols. Yet, in those first weeks, the U-boats demonstrated what even a small force could accomplish with discipline and coordination. Early targets were struck with efficiency. British merchant ships, still adjusting to wartime procedures, often traveled alone or with minimal escort. Convoys existed in theory, but not yet in practice. The ocean still held the habits of peacetime, a vulnerability that Donitz understood would not last long. If the U-boats were to make an impact, it had to be in these early months, before the Allies adapted. One of the first events that signaled the seriousness of the new conflict occurred with the sinking of the passenger liner Athenia. It was a tragedy, triggered by misidentification and nerves in the tense early hours of the war. The incident drew sharp international criticism and pushed Germany to impose stricter rules of engagement temporarily. From that point on, commanders were reminded that submarine warfare required caution not only against military retaliation, but against political consequences. Yet beneath the surface of these orders lay an undeniable truth. The war at sea would grow more aggressive as both sides hardened. As the patrols continued, U-boats began to hunt deeper into the North Sea and the North Atlantic. Crews quickly learned that wartime sailing demanded constant alertness. Even in calm weather, lookouts rotated frequently to prevent fatigue. Hydrophone operators listened intently to the faint hum of propellers across miles of water. Navigators charted courses carefully, avoiding known minefields and areas likely watched by enemy aircraft. The ocean became a chessboard where every movement carried risk. Despite the dangers, early patrols yielded significant results. Submarines like U-47 under Günther Prien executed daring missions that captured headlines and shook Allied confidence. Prien's attack on the Royal Navy anchorage at Scapa Flow, where he sank the battleship HMS Royal Oak, demonstrated that U-boats were not simply commerce raiders, but capable of striking at the heart of Britain's maritime strength. His mission electrified the German public and encouraged the submariners who watched from afar, understanding that such bold actions would be rare but powerful. Yet for every success, the early months also exposed the fragility of Germany's position. The notorious torpedo failures of 1939 and early 1940 became a source of enormous frustration. Some torpedoes detonated prematurely, others failed to detonate at all. A few ran too deep, slipping harmlessly beneath their targets. Commanders returned from patrols with disbelief etched into their faces, describing situations where perfect firing solutions had resulted in failure. It was a technical issue, and it could be solved, but not immediately. Meanwhile, the early war demanded results. The crews bore the emotional weight of these failures deeply. Torpedoes were their primary weapons, carefully maintained and handled with respect. To watch them fail at the critical moment created a mix of anger, helplessness, and determination. Engineers worked tirelessly to diagnose and correct the problems, often under immense pressure. Eventually, improvements came, but not before opportunities were lost and risks multiplied. As the war entered the winter of 1939, the North Atlantic grew colder, harsher, and more unpredictable. Storms battered the small submarines relentlessly. Icy waves crashed over conning towers. Inside the boats, condensation dripped from every surface, turning bunks damp and clothing stiff with salt. Meals were simple and repetitive, often eaten while the boat rolled violently. But even these hardships carried a strange rhythm. that submariners accepted as part of their world. The sea was a harsh companion, but a familiar one. Despite the challenges, the crews adapted quickly, relying on routines that brought order to the confined spaces. Watches rotated evenly. Engines were checked constantly. Torpedoes were inspected daily. Even small tasks, such as cleaning valves or polishing brass, provided structure. A submarine at sea relied on discipline, and discipline kept fear from creeping into the corners of the mind. The early months also saw the beginning of Britain's adaptation. Convoys began to form more regularly. Escorts became more vigilant. Aircraft extended their patrols. The Royal Navy studied U-boat attacks carefully, learning from each engagement. Germany's window of early advantage was closing, and Donitz knew it. He urged for more submarines, more trained crews, and more aggressive tactics, while the balance still favored the U-boat arm. Yet, even as challenges grew, the morale among early U-boat crews remained notably strong. Sailors believed in their mission and in their camaraderie. Many came from families with naval traditions. Others joined seeking purpose in a turbulent era. Whatever brought them aboard, life in a submarine forged bonds stronger than most could imagine. Shared danger, shared exhaustion, and shared hope created a brotherhood that transcended rank. As winter gave way to spring in 1940, the U-boat arm stood at a crossroads. Early successes proved the effectiveness of submarines. Early failures revealed the need for rapid improvements. And all the while, the strategic landscape of Europe was shifting rapidly. Germany's campaign in the West would soon change the entire geography of the war at sea. The capture of France and its Atlantic ports would open the ocean in ways the U-boats had only dreamed of. But in these first months, before the major turning points arrived, the U-boat story unfolded in small steel. Boats fighting through cold seas, learning with each encounter, adjusting to every setback, and preparing for a conflict that would soon grow far larger than anyone could have imagined. The opening phase of the war at sea was not defined by dramatic victories or catastrophic losses, but by the slow, steady tightening of gears that would eventually drive the Battle of the Atlantic into full motion. It was a time of tension, perseverance, and discovery. And for the men aboard those submarines, it was the beginning of a journey that would lead them deep into history and deeper still into the unforgiving heart of the North Atlantic. With these early lessons shaping their future, the U-boats began to evolve from scattered hunters into a coordinated force. The moment was approaching when Donitz's Wolfpack concept, still largely theoretical, would find its first true test in the wide, open waters beyond Europe's shores. The first Wolfpacks take shape. The spring and summer of 1940 brought changes to Europe that reshaped every corner of the war, including the one unfolding beneath the waves. As Germany advanced across the continent, political borders shifted, armies moved, and entire nations braced for a conflict that was widening by the day. But nowhere did these changes matter more to the U-boat arm than along the coast of France. For the submariners who had been operating from Germany's northern ports, forced to travel through narrow seas full of British patrols, the capture of France was not simply a territorial gain, it was a transformation of the entire war at sea. New bases along the Bay of Biscay opened a gateway to the Atlantic, unlike anything the U-boats had previously possessed. Ports such as Lorient, Brest, La Rochelle, and Saint-Nazaire suddenly placed the submarines directly on the edge of the open ocean. What once required days of travel through dangerous waters could now be reached in a single night's journey. The distance to the shipping lanes shrank, the risk of early detection declined. The submarines could carry more torpedoes, more fuel, and more provisions. Crews found themselves departing into the vastness of the Atlantic with an advantage they had never known. With this new accessibility came the opportunity Donitz had been waiting for. The Wolfpack idea, until now limited by the small size and scattered nature of the U-boat fleet, finally had the room, resources, and strategic position to be tested at full scale. Though the fleet still lacked the numbers Donitz dreamed of, The improved geography allowed even a modest force to operate with far greater flexibility. The first coordinated attacks began cautiously. A few submarines would spread out across a wide area, maintaining just enough distance to cover hundreds of miles of ocean, yet close enough to share information quickly. When one boat sighted a convoy, the others shifted toward it, adjusting their courses in slow arcs guided by radio reports. These early attempts did not always go smoothly. Sometimes, a submarine lost contact and never reconnected. Sometimes, the convoys changed course. Weather could scatter the pack. Radio transmissions, brief as they were, could be intercepted. But even these imperfect beginnings revealed the power of cooperation. The early Wolfpack engagements showed patterns the submariners had only discussed in classrooms. A single U-boat, attacking alone, faced limited opportunities. It could fire a few torpedoes and then dive deep, spending precious time evading escorts instead of pursuing more targets. But when several boats converged on the same convoy, everything changed. Escorts were forced to divide their attention. Any destroyer chasing one submarine left a gap for another. Torpedoes launched from multiple directions overwhelmed defenses. And while one boat dove to avoid depth charges, another was already maneuvering into position. These coordinated attacks created a sense of momentum, not frenzied or chaotic, but methodical and relentless. At night, on the surface, the submarines glided in dark silence, their crews scanning the horizon through binoculars, searching for the silhouettes of ships against the faint glow of starlight. The ocean, usually indifferent, became suddenly alive with tension. A convoy that might have felt secure a few hours earlier found itself surrounded without warning. For the merchant sailors, it was a terrifying introduction to the new reality of the war at sea. One of the earliest Wolfpack operations that demonstrated this new potential unfolded in the North Atlantic during the summer of 1940. Several U-boats, working in concert, attacked a convoy crossing from Canada toward Britain. The submariners approached carefully, coordinated through coded messages, and struck in the dark hours when visibility favored them. Torpedoes streaked through the water, leaving trails of bubbles illuminated only by faint moonlight. Ships carrying food, fuel, and essential supplies shuddered under the impact. Escorts scrambled to respond, but found themselves unsure of where to turn first. The ocean around them held too many threats. When reports reached Donitz's headquarters, the results confirmed his belief. Coordinated submarine tactics could break through convoy defenses in ways a single boat never could. But Donitz also saw the problems. Communications needed to be faster. Coordination needed to be tighter. The submarines needed better tools for maintaining contact with convoys, especially during storms or evasive maneuvers. And above all, Germany needed more boats. The crews who participated in these first Wolfpack operations returned to port with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. Many of them had been at sea for weeks, navigating harsh weather, limited food, and the constant pressure of combat. They arrived at their French bases to find cheering crowds, military bands, and newspapers ready to celebrate their victories. But, beneath the public praise, the sailors carried private memories. Ships sinking in the night, lifeboats drifting in cold seas, engines shaking under the force of depth charges, and the knowledge that the ocean was as pitiless to friend as to foe. Inside the U-boats, the attacks had been anything but glamorous. When a convoy fought back, the submarines were forced to dive deep, their hulls creaking as pressure mounted. Depth charges exploded above them, shaking every bolt and pipe, sending tools and charts crashing to the floor. Lights flickered, men braced themselves, and oxygen levels dropped in the stagnant air. Even after the explosion stopped, the tension lingered, a silent weight pushing against every heartbeat until the boat finally surfaced hours later to breathe again. Despite these dangers, morale among the U-boat crews remained surprisingly strong. The sense of purpose that filled these early operations gave the sailors something that made the hardship bearable: feeling that their sacrifices might shape the course of the war. They believed that if they could cut off Britain's supplies, the conflict might end quickly. They believed their actions had meaning in the world beyond the steel hull of their submarine. The development of the Wolfpacks also fostered a growing sense of camaraderie between commanders. Officers who had once operated alone now worked together, sharing information, planning maneuvers, and communicating throughout dangerous operations. These bonds did not end when the patrol ended. In ports like Lorient, commanders gathered to discuss tactics, evaluate what worked and what failed, and prepare for the next patrol. They spoke of the need for better equipment, faster communications, and more aggressive training. Many knew each other by name, reputation, and experience, forming a tight-knit community shaped by shared danger and shared goals. But as successful as these early operations were, the sailors and commanders also sensed that the war was changing. The Allies were not standing still. British escorts were learning from each engagement, developing new techniques, and adjusting convoy formations. Aircraft patrols were increasing, and new technologies were already being tested in quiet laboratories far from the sea. The Wolfpacks had proven their strength, but they had not achieved dominance yet. The battle for the Atlantic was only beginning to unfold. Still, in these early successes, the U-boats found the momentum they needed. They saw in coordinated operations a glimpse of what might be possible. They understood that the ocean could be shaped not by individual effort alone, but by collective strategy. And they believed that the Wolfpacks, still small, still imperfect, held within them the potential to alter the war. For the moment, the submariners allowed themselves to feel the satisfaction of progress. They returned to their bases to rest, repair their boats, and share stories with their system comrades. They studied reports and prepared for the next patrol. And somewhere beyond the horizon, convoys continued to form and set out across the vast, cold waters, unaware of whether the ocean that awaited them was empty or whether the wolves had already begun to gather in silence. With these first coordinated attacks, the Wolfpack doctrine took its first true steps into history, and soon, events in Europe would open the ocean even wider, giving the U-boats the opportunity to unleash their strategy on a scale neither side had yet imagined. France falls, a new gateway to the Atlantic. When France fell in the summer of 1940, the shock echoed across Europe. Borders changed, governments collapsed, and armies reeled under the speed and scale of the German advance. To many people on land, the fall of France felt like the end of an era, a shift so sudden that even those who followed the news closely struggled to understand how quickly the world had turned. But for the U-boat force, the consequences were immediate, practical, and profound. It reshaped their war entirely, opening doors that had been closed since the First World War and giving them access to the Atlantic in a way they had never imagined possible. Before France's defeat, German submarines had been forced to operate from bases along the North Sea and the Baltic. Every patrol began with the same dangerous routine, threading through the narrow, heavily watched waters around Britain. The routes were constricted, filled with destroyers, mines, and aircraft. Submarines heading for the Atlantic often spent days simply trying to escape the North Sea. It was a bottleneck that exposed them long before they reached the open ocean. But when France surrendered, everything changed. Suddenly, the Germans possessed a chain of Atlantic ports: Lorient, Brest, La Pallice, Street, Nazaire, and Bordeaux, that faced directly into the very waters where the war at sea would be decided. To understand the significance of this, it helps to picture the geography. Instead of threading between Britain and Scandinavia, U-boats could now slip out into the Bay of Biscay and steer westward into deep water almost immediately. The travel time to the shipping lanes fell dramatically. What had once taken a week or more could now be accomplished in a single night. The strain on engines decreased. Fuel reserves lasted longer. Crews arrived in patrol zones rested rather than exhausted. and the number of days available for hunting increased. It was as if the ocean had turned sideways, revealing a hidden door. The U-boat command moved quickly to take advantage of this opportunity. Bases in France were fortified and expanded at a speed that astonished even the sailors who watched them grow. Concrete pens, massive bomb-proof shelters, rose from the harbors like monolithic structures from another age. They were built to withstand direct hits from Allied bombs, their roofs several meters thick, reinforced with steel. Inside these shelters, submarines could be repaired, resupplied, and protected from air attack. They became the beating heart of the U-boat fleet, dark, echoing structures that swallowed boats whole and returned them to the sea, ready for another patrol. Life in the French bases carried a strange contrast. Outside, the towns lived under occupation, their streets filled with tension, rationing, and the quiet resistance of a population adjusting to foreign control. But inside the submarine bunkers, the atmosphere was entirely different, industrious, focused, and filled with the noise of welders, cranes, and engines. Crews who had once slept in cramped barracks in Germany now found themselves living near the Atlantic coast, training, repairing equipment, and preparing for patrols that no longer required the long northward journey. For the submariners themselves, the move to France brought a mixture of relief and new responsibility. The relief came from the simple fact that their boats no longer had to risk the treacherous waters of the British coast to reach the Atlantic. The new responsibility came from knowing that with easier access to their hunting grounds came higher expectations. Donitz understood that the bases in France made the Wolfpack doctrine far more viable. Boats could coordinate more easily, overlap patrol zones, and return to port faster for repairs. The entire operational rhythm of the U-boat arm shifted. Crews departing from the Bay of Biscay found themselves in an environment that was both beautiful and dangerous. The coastline was rugged, wind-swept, and vast. The water shifted from gray-green shallows to deep blue expanses within a few miles. But Allied aircraft, aware of the new German presence, soon intensified their patrols in the area. Leaving or entering French ports meant crossing a zone increasingly watched by enemy planes. Submarines learned to depart at night, hugging the coastline, or diving repeatedly to avoid detection. The Bay of Biscay would become one of the most perilous stretches of ocean for U-boats in the later years of the war, but in 1940, it represented opportunity more than threat. The new French bases also expanded the reach of the German submarine fleet in ways that extended beyond the North Atlantic. Boats began patrolling farther south, approaching the shipping routes near Gibraltar and even the coast of West Africa. These regions had been nearly impossible to reach from Germany's northern ports, but now submarines could operate in waters where convoys traveled with fewer escorts. The war at sea became larger, stretching across thousands of miles, and the Allies found themselves scrambling to adjust to the new threat. Inside the U-boats, the sailors felt the change as soon as they left the safety of the pens. The first nights at sea from the French bases were often described as extraordinary, not because of danger, but because of how quickly the ocean swallowed them. The boats would glide out under cover of darkness, engines humming softly, leaving behind the lights of Lorient or Brest until only blackness remained. For a few hours, the calm was almost deceiving. The crews knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, convoys were making their crossings. They had charts, predicted routes, and orders to coordinate with other boats. But the first night always held a quiet anticipation, the sense of standing on the edge of something immense. These early days operating from France also revealed the practicality of the Wolfpack strategy. Boats could be directed to wider patrol lines. They could respond faster to convoy sightings. They could pursue targets deeper into the Atlantic without fearing they would run short of fuel. The French bases turned what had once been a limited submarine arm into a force that could operate across broad expanses of ocean. The crews felt this shift every time they plotted their courses. Maps that once showed constrained patrol zones now opened into sweeping arcs across the mid-Atlantic. At the same time, the submariners recognized the human cost that the new bases would bring. Relocation meant long separations from families in Germany. Letters traveled slowly. Even when boats returned to port, the moments of rest were brief. Men slept on shore in hastily built barracks or requisitioned buildings, visited cafes when allowed, and tried to find small pockets of normal life in a foreign land. Yet, just as often, they spent their downtime inside the massive concrete pens, maintaining their boats under the dim yellow glow of industrial lights. And yet, despite the challenges, morale remained high. Successes grew more frequent. Convoys suffered heavier losses. Donitz's belief in coordinated submarine warfare seemed to be proving itself with each new engagement. The combination of French bases and disciplined coordination had turned the U-boats into a genuine threat. Many sailors felt they were witnessing the rise of a new era in naval warfare, one where submarines, not battleships, would play the decisive role. But the Allies were watching, learning, adapting. They recognized the danger the French bases presented. They began deploying more aircraft. They expanded convoy systems, and far to the north, in rooms filled with mathematicians and cryptanalysts, the British were beginning the long, patient work of unraveling the German naval codes. For now, though, the advantage lay with the U-boats. The capture of France had opened the ocean, given them shelter, and expanded their reach. The Wolfpacks were no longer an emerging idea, they were becoming a reality. Soon, in the dark waters of the mid-Atlantic, that reality would reach its peak. The first happy time, the summer of 1940, opened a chapter that many U-boat veterans would remember, with a mixture of pride, disbelief, and later, a haunting sense of how quickly fortune can turn. In the months following the fall of France, Germany's submarines entered what history would call the first happy time, a period when the Wolfpacks gained an undeniable advantage, and the Atlantic, vast and vulnerable, offered opportunities that seemed almost endless. But beneath this surface of success, there were complexities the men only understood fully in hindsight. Victory at sea is never as simple as the numbers that record it. For the sailors aboard those early U-boats, the feeling of this new era began the moment they cleared the French coastline and tipped their bows toward the open Atlantic. They were no longer fighting for access to the ocean. They already possessed it. Patrol zones, once considered unreachable, now lay within comfortable range. The sea lanes flowing between North America and Britain became their new hunting ground, and the convoys that crossed them were, at least for a time, unprepared for the scale and speed of the threat gathering beneath the waves. British shipping still relied heavily on procedures shaped by peacetime thinking. Convoys existed, but many were loosely organized, and escort vessels were far too few to protect every group of valuable merchant ships. Some captains, accustomed to operating independently, resisted the convoy system altogether, believing they could outrun danger rather than hide within a group. The result was precisely what Donitz had predicted years earlier: isolated targets spread across a wide, unguarded ocean. The Wolfpacks could not have wished for more favorable conditions. The first happy time unfolded quietly at first. A few ships fell victim to submarines, shadowing the western approaches to Britain. But as the months passed, the scale increased. U-boats began to operate with the confidence that the French bases provided. They patrolled farther west, intercepting convoys long before they came within reach of coastal aircraft. Their successes multiplied, each patrol returning with reports of sinkings that surpassed expectations. Merchant vessels vanished into cold waters, sometimes without transmitting distress signals, sometimes without warning at all. For the German crews, these victories meant something beyond strategic numbers. They felt they were giving their country a chance to break the British blockade and force a quicker end to the war. They believed that if Britain's supply lines could be strangled, the government in London might be forced to negotiate. Many submariners, especially the younger ones who had grown up during the hardships of the 1920 seconds, carried a sincere belief that every successful patrol might shorten the conflict. Their motivations were shaped not only by duty, but by personal history, by the stories of hunger and unemployment that had defined their childhood years. Life aboard the U-boats during this period carried a strange mix of routine and adrenaline. Days at sea often passed quietly, with long hours spent scanning the horizon, listening through hydrophones, and maintaining the endless machinery that kept the boat alive. Then, suddenly, a lookout would shout a sighting, a faint plume of smoke on the horizon, the outline of a ship growing clearer through binoculars. And with that sighting came a shift in atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations stopped. The engines changed pitch. The commander stepped onto the bridge with calm determination. The hunt had begun. Night attacks became the hallmark of this period. On the surface, a U-boat was a fast, sleek vessel capable of outrunning many escorts. In darkness, it all but vanished against the black water. Commanders used this to their advantage, approaching convoys at night and slipping between columns of ships without being detected. Navigating through scattered silhouettes in the dark required steady nerves and exceptional skill. A wrong turn could place a submarine directly in the path of a freighter traveling at full speed. But when executed correctly, the maneuver allowed the U-boats to release torpedoes at point-blank range and escape before escorts could locate them. The sea during these attacks took on a strange character. The silence before the strike felt heavy, as though the ocean itself were holding its breath. Torpedoes raced through the water with a faint hiss, and moments later, explosions erupted across the convoy. Ships rolled violently as water rushed in. Lights flickered, then disappeared. Men scrambled for lifeboats as alarms rang out. The ocean, moments earlier calm, became a stage lit by fire and fear. For many U-boat crewmen, these scenes left impressions that stayed with them long after the war. In the immediate excitement of combat, they focused on survival and execution. But the memories lingered, the faces they sometimes glimpsed, the lifeboats drifting behind them, the realization that each sinking was both a military success and a human tragedy. These contradictions formed part of the complex emotional landscape of the country's submariners, one rarely spoken aloud but carried silently through each patrol. The happy time also elevated several commanders to near legendary status, men whose skill, daring, and intuition brought them repeated success. Gunther Prien, Joachim Schepke, and Otto Kretschmer became well-known names, celebrated in German newspapers and admired by their crews. Their accomplishments were not exaggerated. They genuinely achieved remarkable results under dangerous conditions. But even these men understood that their success came from factors greater than individual talent. They benefited from surprise, from allied inexperience, and from conditions that could not last forever. Inside the U-boats, despite the victories, life remained harsh. The heat from diesel engines made interiors stifling. Moisture condensed on walls and ceilings, dripping onto bunks without warning. Food supplies degraded quickly, especially during longer patrols. Fresh water was rationed carefully. Men slept wherever they could, including atop torpedoes or in narrow spaces between machinery. Maintaining alertness under such conditions required discipline, and the crews maintained it with remarkable consistency. Yet, morale during this period remained high. The submariners felt the momentum shifting in their favor. They saw the British merchant fleet strained. They understood that each sinking placed pressure on a nation dependent on imported food, fuel, and materials. In Germany, their return to port was met with announcements of success, ceremonies, and sometimes personal greetings from high-ranking officials. Medals were awarded. Letters were written home proudly. Even the older officers allowed themselves moments of optimism. But beneath this confidence, there were signs that the happy time was not a permanent condition. Commands from British naval headquarters grew sharper and more coordinated. Escorts received better training. Convoy tactics improved. New technologies still, in early development, began to trickle onto Allied ships and aircraft. Intelligence analysts studied U-boat behavior closely, and in code-breaking centers across the channel, men and women worked tirelessly to understand the patterns of German naval communications. The submariners did not yet know what challenges awaited them, but a few sensed that the tide would eventually turn. The ocean, vast and uncaring, does not grant advantage indefinitely. Every successful patrol carried risk, and with each return to port, crews wondered quietly how long their luck would hold. Still, in those early years, the Wolfpacks believed the sea belonged to them. The horizon seemed open. The ocean felt wide and welcoming. The night offered shelter, and the numbers, those stark, strategic figures that defined wartime supply and survival, leaned in their favor. The first happy time would come to an end, as all such periods do. But for a brief moment, the U-boats held the upper hand, and the ocean listened to them more than it resisted. It was during this fleeting chapter that the Wolfpacks reached their earliest peak, unaware of the storm of innovation, intelligence, and resistance that was already gathering far beyond their sight. Inside the U-boat, daily life. Below the waves. For those who have never stepped inside a submarine, it can be difficult to imagine what daily life truly felt like for the young men who spent weeks or months sealed inside steel hulls beneath the Atlantic. Photographs show narrow corridors, cramped bunks, and rows of machinery, but they cannot fully convey the atmosphere, the closeness of the air, the constant vibration of engines, the mixture of routine and tension that shaped every hour of a patrol. During the height of the U-boat campaign, hundreds of men experienced this world, a world that demanded endurance, flexibility, and a steady mind. The first thing newcomers noticed upon entering a U-boat was the smell. It was not unpleasant, in a simple sense, but it was unmistakable. A combination of diesel fumes, machine oil, damp clothing, metal, and the faint sourness that comes from so many bodies living in a confined space. Fresh air existed only when the submarine was on the surface with hatches open. Once submerged, the inside atmosphere grew still and heavy. The crew became used to it, but even experienced sailors found those first moments after diving a reminder that they had entered an environment utterly different from life on land. Space was the second shock. Everything inside a U-boat was packed together without an inch wasted. Torpedoes were stacked like enormous silver cylinders in the bow and stern. Pipes and cables lined the ceiling and walls. Radio equipment filled corners beside bunks. The control room, stuffed with valves, gauges, and levers, served as the heart of the boat. Yet even there, movement required slipping sideways, bending knees, and ducking beneath equipment. Privacy did not exist. Man slept, ate, and worked with others only inches away from him. For many sailors, the lack of personal space quickly became the most challenging aspect of submarine life. There was no room to stretch out fully unless you were lucky enough to find an unoccupied spot on the floor between shifts. Bunk space was limited, so the system of hot bunking became standard practice. One man would sleep while another worked his watch, and when their shifts changed, they would exchange places. The mattress was always warm, not from comfort, but from the body heat of the previous occupant. Blankets stayed damp from condensation. A sailor's possessions, usually little more than a small bag, containing photographs, letters, and a few personal items, were stored wherever space allowed. Meals provided one of the few breaks from the monotony, though even food came with complications. The galley was a tiny corner, barely large enough for the cook to turn around. Meals had to be prepared, with limited ingredients, most of which degraded quickly. Fresh produce lasted only a few days. Bread quickly developed mold in the humid conditions. Potatoes sprouted. Canned goods and preserved meats formed the backbone of every diet. Coffee was a treasured commodity, and crewmen savored each cup, even when the flavor turned bitter from age or storage conditions. On rough days, when the boat pitched violently in heavy seas, eating became a challenge. Plates slid, cups spilled, and men often found themselves gripping railings with one hand while trying to finish a meal with the other. Despite these hardships, daily routines brought structure to life aboard. The crew was divided into watches, rotating shifts that kept the submarine operating smoothly at all hours. Men on watch monitored equipment, stood lookout when surfaced, listened through hydrophones, or managed engines. Those off-duty slept, wrote letters, played cards, read books, or simply sat in silence, preserving their energy. The lack of sunlight and irregular sleep cycles gradually blurred the sense of time. Days and nights blended into an unbroken rhythm of mechanical hums and whispered conversations. One of the most important roles aboard was that of the hydrophone operator, the man who listened to the ocean, sitting quietly with headphones pressed against his ears. He could detect sounds from miles away, the steady beat of merchant ship propellers, the sharper rhythm of destroyers, or the distant rumble of storms moving across the water. When danger lurked, his calm report could mean the difference between life and death. The crew relied on these ears in the deep as much as they relied on the commander's judgment. The commander, in turn, bore a weight that few outside the submarine service truly understood. He knew every decision might carry immediate consequences. To remain surfaced for speed risked aircraft detection. To dive too early risked losing contact with a valuable target. To fire a torpedo meant committing to a course of action that could reveal his boat's location. Sleep came in short periods, often interrupted by alarms or messages. Commanders learned to rest lightly, always prepared to wake fully within seconds. Their men trusted them completely, recognizing that inside those narrow steel walls, leadership was not abstract, it was survival. Yet life aboard a U-boat was not constant strain. Small moments of normalcy broke through the tension. Sailors shared stories while off duty, laughing at memories from training or life back home. Someone might bring out a harmonica or sketch scenes in a notebook. Cards were played quietly at makeshift tables. Birthdays were celebrated with whatever supplies the cook could manage. On long patrols, these moments became anchors for morale, brief reminders that humanity persisted even in the confines of a warship hidden beneath the surface. Every crew developed its own personality over time. Inside jokes, routines, and habits formed naturally through shared experience. Officers were close to the crew, often working side by side, rather than maintaining strict separation. The hardship of submarine life created bonds stronger than rank. Older men took younger ones under their wing, offering advice for managing homesickness or fear. New recruits gradually learned to read the moods of the boat, when to stay quiet, when to lend a hand, and when to simply listen. There was also a silence unique to submarines, especially when submerged. The engines quieted, the lights dimmed, and conversations dropped to murmurs. Every man knew that sound traveled far underwater, and noise could reveal their position. In such moments, sailors heard things rarely noticed on land: the shifting of valves, the faint movement of water past the hull, the creaking of steel under pressure. These sounds did not alarm them. They became part of the boat's identity, as familiar as the voices of their crewmates. But the same silence could turn tense in an instant when depth charges fell. During attacks, life aboard changed completely. Everything that had been routine became urgent. The crew braced for impacts, gripping pipes or edges of machinery as the submarine lurched under the force of explosions. Lights flickered. Dust shook loose from overhead. Tools rattled. The air thickened with heat and anxiety. Men breathed quietly, conserving every moment of calm they could. After an attack, the boat often held its breath collectively, waiting to see if the enemy had shifted away or if another barrage was coming. In the aftermath, the crew inspected every part of the submarine, checking for leaks, cracked lines, or damaged equipment. They worked swiftly and silently, their movements practiced and sure. Relief washed over them only when the boat surfaced again hours later and fresh air poured into lung and steel alike. Despite the dangers, many submariners later said that what kept them going was not ideology or rewards, but one another. The crew became a second family, one bound by trust, forged through close quarters, and shared danger. They held on to this camaraderie even on the darkest nights, relying on each other for endurance, courage, and the simple reassurance that no one faced the deep alone. As the Wolfpacks began to take shape and their successes increased, life inside the U-boats remained a world unseen by most people of the time. Above, nations shifted, convoys traveled, and newspapers printed headlines. Below, men lived in a world of steel corridors, dim lights, recycled air, and the unbroken heartbeat of engines pushing them through the Atlantic. It was in these cramped spaces, far from the surface and far from home, that the true spirit of the U-boat crews was formed. And as the war moved forward, the courage and endurance they carried within them would be tested again and again, in waters growing ever more dangerous with each passing month. Anatomy of a Wolfpack attack. In the long sweep of the Atlantic War, there were few moments more tense or unforgettable than the hours leading up to a Wolfpack attack. For the men aboard the U-boats, these operations were the culmination of everything they had trained. For the drills, the discipline, the hours spent listening to the ocean, the long stretches of silence broken only by the hum of engines. When a convoy was finally found and a Wolfpack gathered to strike, a complex sequence of events unfolded across miles of dark ocean, each step influenced by weather, timing, instinct, and the calm resolve of men who knew they were entering the most dangerous part of their patrol. The beginning of an attack usually came quietly. A single U-boat, patrolling along its assigned line, would catch sight of something unusual on the horizon: a faint column of smoke, a dim shape in the twilight, or the distant flicker of lights from a careless merchant ship. Lookouts, standing on the bridge, with cold wind rushing past them, often sensed these signs before they were fully visible. Once the suspicion was confirmed through binoculars or hydrophone reports, the commander knew what he had found: a convoy. At that moment, the submarine did not attack. Instead, it shadowed the convoy, keeping a careful distance, trailing behind like a silent observer. The commander needed information course, speed, formation, and the strength of the escorts. He sent short, encrypted messages back to headquarters and to other U-boats nearby. These messages were brief, often no more than a few coded words, because longer transmissions risked detection by Allied listening stations, but they carried enough detail to set everything in motion. As dusk settled across the Atlantic, the first boats began to converge. They approached from different directions, guided not by sight alone, but by the reports of the shadowing submarine. The Wolfpack did not gather in a tight cluster. Instead, they moved into positions that allowed them to strike from multiple angles. The ocean in those moments seemed alive with unseen movement, dark shapes traveling just below the surface or gliding silently in the gloom, waiting for the right moment. The commanders aboard these boats prepared their crews with quiet efficiency. Orders were spoken softly. Torpedoes were checked and loaded. Navigation officers plotted updated positions. The men knew what was coming, but there was no loud anticipation, no dramatic rush of activity. Everything was controlled and steady. A U-boat attack depended on discipline more than adrenaline. When night fully fell, the ocean became both ally and enemy. Darkness offered cover, but it also increased the risk of collision, misjudgment, or detection by escorts using searchlights or flares. Still, night attacks were favored because they allowed the submarines to operate on the surface, where they were faster and could maneuver quickly between ships. On the surface, a U-boat approached quietly, its silhouette blending into the dark sea. In many operations, commanders navigated directly into the gaps between columns of merchant ships. It was a dangerous maneuver, the margin for error small, the consequences severe, but if done properly, it allowed the submarine to fire torpedoes at close range before slipping away into the night. Inside the boat, as it approached firing position, the atmosphere tightened. Men spoke barely above whispers. The bow torpedo room prepared for the firing order. The torpedo officer made his final calculations, measuring distance and angle through a narrow periscope tube. The hum of the engines quieted as the commander ordered reduced speed to avoid detection. Every man aboard knew his role, whether it was loading torpedoes, monitoring gauges, listening through the hydrophones, or standing ready to dive if the enemy responded. Then came the moment when the commander decided to strike. Often, he waited for deadline, the convoy's position to shift slightly, or for an opening to appear between two ships. When the moment arrived, his words were crisp and final. Torpedoes fired with a hiss, leaving white trails in the water invisible in darkness, but unmistakable on the instruments. Seconds passed long, breath-held seconds, and then explosions burst across the sea. The first blast created chaos. Ships rolled under the force, alarms rang out, and men scrambled on deck. Escorts reacted quickly, searching for the attacker, launching flares into the sky, illuminating the waves with bright light that turned night into a harsh, flickering battlefield. But before the defenders could respond, another U-boat, positioned on the far side of the convoy, launched its torpedoes, then another, and sometimes another. The Wolfpack strategy relied on this overwhelming pressure. While one submarine drew attention, others slipped in unnoticed. Escorts that turned to chase one attacker left their flanks open for the next. Merchant ships attempted evasive maneuvers, but in a close-packed convoy, there was little room to run. The ocean filled with the sound of engines, the crash of waves, shouts from ship to ship, and the dull roar of explosions echoing across the surface. As soon as a U-boat fired its torpedoes, it maneuvered away, sometimes diving, sometimes staying on the surface to use its speed. Diving carried risk, submerged movement was slower, and escorts could drop depth charges. Remaining on the surface allowed a faster escape, but exposed the boat to gunfire or ramming attempts. Commanders chose their actions based on instinct, honed by experience. Inside the submarine during these moments, life became a study in tension. Men braced themselves as the boat turned sharply. Loose items slid across the floor, despite the crew's efforts to secure everything. If the submarine dove, the crew felt the sudden downward angle, the shift in ballast, the rapid closing of hatches. At deeper depths, the water pressed against the hull with increasing weight, and the familiar creaking of steel reminded everyone that the ocean was not a forgiving place. If escorts located the submarine, the attack changed instantly from offense to survival. Depth charges iron cylinders packed with explosives detonated above, shaking the hull violently. Lights flickered. Dust fell from valves overhead. The air grew hotter. Men gripped pipes, bunks, or whatever they could find as the submarine rocked under pressure. The commander listened through the hydrophones, trying to read the patterns of the enemy's search. Silence became the crew's only defense. Engines were shut down. Men stayed motionless. The submarine drifted slowly, waiting for the danger to pass. Above, the escort ships circled. Flares drifted down in orange arcs. Merchant ships tried to maintain formation. Fires from stricken vessels lit parts of the ocean in unsettling ways. Lifeboats lowered into the waves. The night became a patchwork of calm and chaos, sound and silence. Once a U-boat escaped immediate danger, the commander decided whether to rejoin the attack. Many did. The strength of the Wolfpack lay in persistence. As long as the convoy remained within striking distance, the submarines would regroup. Sometimes attacks lasted hours. Sometimes they continued into the next night. Merchant ships that had survived the initial strike found themselves facing new threats, new flashes of light, new eruptions of sound. Escorts exhausted themselves, chasing shadows across the waves. For the U-boat crews, these long engagements tested their stamina as much as their skill. Little sleep was possible. Meals were taken hurriedly, if at all. The submarine grew hot and cramped. Tempers remained in check only through discipline and mutual respect. Yet, amid the exhaustion and danger, there was also a sense of incredible focus. Every man aboard understood his role with clarity, sharpened by necessity. At dawn, the battle often changed. Light exposed submarines on the surface. Aircraft patrols, if present, joined the defense. U-boats that remained in the area had to dive or break away. Some continued shadowing the convoy for another night attack. Others, damaged or low on torpedoes, returned to base. The ocean in early morning carried the scars of the night, debris drifting in the swell, oil slicks spreading across the water, and survivors huddled in lifeboats waiting for rescue. When the Wolfpack withdrew, the convoy limped onward. Some ships would reach their destination, others would not. The men aboard the U-boats rarely saw the aftermath. They only knew that they had carried out their orders, endured their dangers, and survived another chapter of the war beneath the waves. A Wolfpack attack was not simply a tactical maneuver. It was a complex orchestration of timing, communication, courage, and endurance. It unfolded on a canvas of darkness and uncertainty, shaped by commanders' instincts and crews' discipline. For the Germans, it represented the pinnacle of coordinated submarine warfare. For the Allies, it was a threat that demanded a new level of innovation and resilience. And for the men inside those narrow steel boats, it was an experience that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. A memory of the vast ocean, the cold air, the tense silence before the strike, and the long hours beneath the waves when survival hung on the edge of every decision. The second happy time. U-boats off America's coast. When Germany declared war on the United States in December 1941, many wondered how the Atlantic would change. American industry was vast, its navy powerful, and its coastline long and exposed. But few, even among seasoned sailors, anticipated how quickly the U-boats would appear off North America and how devastating their early patrols would become. The months that followed formed what German submariners later called the second happy time, a period of striking success that revealed the vulnerabilities of a nation not yet fully prepared for the scale of maritime warfare unfolding just beyond its shores. In the winter of 1942, U-boats crossed the Atlantic with a purpose sharpened by opportunity. Donitz saw what his crews saw, a coastline illuminated at night by cities that had not yet adopted blackout measures, shipping lanes unguarded or poorly organized, and merchant vessels traveling alone or in small groups without escorts. The Americans, still mobilizing their vast industrial power, had not yet implemented the convoy system that Britain had refined over 2 years of difficult lessons. In those first months, the ocean along the East Coast became a hunting ground unlike anything the U-boats had seen before. The submarines moved silently through the cold waters from New England to the Carolinas, down toward Florida, and across the Gulf of Mexico. Commanders described the coastline as a dark ribbon bordered by beads of light, the glow of coastal towns, passing cars, lighthouses, and industrial plants. Against this backdrop, merchant ships sailed as brightly lit silhouettes, visible even from miles away. To U-boat lookouts accustomed to the harsh discipline of wartime Europe, it felt surreal, almost dreamlike. But the ease of sighting made the task deadly serious. U-boat commanders found themselves in near-perfect conditions for surface attacks. At night, the silhouette of a merchant vessel stood clearly against the illuminated coast. The submarines could fire torpedoes from close range without diving. Some boats remained on the surface for entire patrols, using their diesel engines to maneuver quickly and release torpedoes with precision. Crews were astonished not by the danger of the mission, but by how little opposition they initially encountered. It took time for reality to settle in. America had not yet grasped how vulnerable its coastline had become. The scale of the early successes was something even Donitz had not predicted. In the first months of 1942, U-boats sank ship after ship, oil tankers, freighters, coastal transports, even vessels within sight of onlookers standing on American beaches. Fires lit the night sky. Oil slicks drifted toward the shore. Lifeboats washed up on beaches. Merchant sailors were rescued by fishermen or Coast Guard cutters. telling stories of torpedoes hitting without warning, of ships breaking apart in minutes, of wakes glowing in the light of American cities. For the U-boat crews, these patrols brought a sense of victory mixed with an uncomfortable awareness of what they were witnessing. The young men serving aboard those submarines were not immune to the human cost of their actions. They saw survivors clinging to wreckage, heard cries drifting across the water, and watched burning ships fade into the distance. Success did not erase these images, but they were sailors fulfilling orders in a war that had now spread across the entire ocean. Duty, discipline, and the rhythm of survival shaped every decision. As weeks passed, U-boats spread out along the coast, using new supplies, new bases, and long-range Type 9 submarines capable of operating far from Europe. Some patrolled the waters off Cape Hatteras, a region that became infamous for the number of ships lost in its shifting currents. Others ventured into the Gulf of Mexico, where oil tankers carrying petroleum from Texas and Louisiana sailed without escort. Still others patrolled the Caribbean, striking at the routes feeding the Panama Canal. The submarines fanned out like silent shadows. Their presence felt long before most Americans understood the scope of the threat. But the ease of early success did not last. By spring 1942, signs of change began to accumulate. The U.S. Navy, initially caught off guard, reorganized rapidly. Convoys, once resisted by shipping companies worried about delays, became mandatory. Escorts increased. Air patrols expanded along the coast. Blackout measures dimmed the glowing coastline that had once served as a backdrop for hunting. Coastal defenses improved. Radar installations multiplied. And above all, American shipyards began producing vessels at a speed unmatched anywhere in the world. Yet even as the Americans improved, the U-boats pressed deeper into their operations. Life aboard the submarines during these months was both intense and monotonous. Patrols lasted longer than those based in France. Boats traveled thousands of miles without the certainty of support. Food supplies suffered. Fresh water remained precious. Sailors endured heat in the tropics and bitter cold farther north. The hum of engines, the creaking of steel, and the tight claustrophobic spaces remained constant companions. Despite the hardships, morale during this period was occasionally high, driven by the results of the missions. But this sense of momentum carried an undercurrent of unease. The Fels ocean off North America was wide, unpredictable, and far from help. Every dive, every encounter, and every torpedo launched carried the silent question of whether the crew would return. The Bay of Biscay was a long journey away, and each patrol tested the endurance of both machinery and men. By mid-1942, the picture began to change decisively. Allied aircraft extended their reach. Escort carriers appeared along convoy routes. Improved radar spotted submarines on the surface at night. Intelligence programs began piecing together U-boat patterns. The Americans were learning quickly, and the window of vulnerability that had allowed the second happy time to unfold was closing just as rapidly. But for a short, intense period of months, the U-boats had reshaped the eastern edge of the Atlantic. They had demonstrated the reach of the Wolfpack strategy, the importance of geography, and the vulnerability of even the most industrially powerful nation when caught unprepared. The sailors, who served during this time, remembered the coastline glowing in the night, the quiet approach of their boats, the sudden explosions that shattered the stillness, and the long, uncertain journeys back across the ocean. The second, happy time, would not last long. Like the first, it was a fleeting advantage shaped by timing and circumstance. But its impact was undeniable. It spurred the Americans to mobilize on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before at sea. It changed the rhythm of the Atlantic War, and it convinced the Allies that the U-boat threat, left unchecked, could reach even their own shores. Soon, the tide would shift again. The Wolfpacks would face new dangers from the sky, new technologies, and a level of coordination that dwarfed anything the early war had seen. But before that turning point arrived, the U-boats carved their mark along the American coast, leaving a trail of shipwrecks and memories scattered across the shallow waters of the continental shelf. It was a chapter remembered vividly by those who witnessed it: sailors, residents, fishermen, coast guardsmen, all of whom saw the war reach their doorsteps in a way few had expected when the conflict first began. And for the U-boat crews, it was a moment when the ocean seemed briefly, deceptively open, just before the Allied counterstroke changed the course of the war for good. The Allies strike back: radar, sonar, and new technologies. By mid-1942, the seas that had once seemed so open to the U-boats began to change. The German submariners felt it gradually. At first, a few more aircraft spotted on the horizon, a few more convoys traveling with escorts that reacted a little faster, a little more confidently. It was not a sudden shift, nor one single invention that turned the tide, but the slow tightening of a net, woven from science, coordination, and the determination of nations that understood the stakes of the Atlantic War. For the first 2 years of the conflict, Allied defenses were often reactive, struggling to keep pace with the flexibility and stealth of the U-boats. But behind the scenes, laboratories, naval bases, and intelligence centers across Britain, America, and Canada were working relentlessly to develop tools that could pierce the shadows in which the submarines operated. As these technologies matured, they gradually transformed the Atlantic from a place where U-boats hunted with near impunity to an environment where danger could appear from above, from the horizon, and even from depths they once considered safe. One of the earliest and most important tools was radar. Britain had begun experimenting with it well before the war, initially to detect aircraft, but wartime necessity pushed researchers to adapt it for maritime use. In the early stages, radar was limited, bulky, imprecise, and prone to interference from waves. Yet even these imperfect systems marked a shift. A submarine on the surface, once hidden by night or fog, could now be detected long before its crew realized an aircraft was approaching. Air crews trained with a new urgency, flying long patrols over the North Atlantic, scanning the sea for faint blips on their screens. At first, U-boat commanders still managed to escape by diving quickly. But as radar improved, the time between detection and attack shrank. The ocean that had once offered darkness as a shield began to betray them. And when centimetric radar arrived, a smaller, far more precise system that could detect even the tiny return of a periscope, the balance shifted decisively. But radar alone did not close the gap. It worked best on aircraft, and aircraft could not yet reach the deepest parts of the ocean. Sonar, known to the British as ASDIC, offered a similar revolution beneath the surface. Using sound waves to locate underwater objects, sonar allowed escort ships to track submarines they could not see. Early versions required steady speed and struggled in rough seas, but improvements came rapidly. Soon, escorts could pinpoint a submerged U-boat's location with far more accuracy than during the desperate days of 1940. For the U-boat crews, sonar was both invisible and terrifying. They could not see the waves that revealed their position, but they could hear the escorts closing in, the hum of engines growing louder, the sharp pings echoing through the hull as the enemy searched for them. The deep, once a refuge, became more dangerous with each month. Air power and detection technology formed the foundation of the Allied response, but just as crucial was the development of new weapons. Depth charges, the old standby of anti-submarine warfare, improved steadily. Larger charges, better fuses, more precise settings, and new throwing devices that allowed escort ships to create patterns of explosions across wider areas. A submerged submarine listening to a pattern of charges deploying above it could feel the growing sophistication of the attackers. Then came Hedgehog, a forward-firing mortar that launched dozens of small explosives ahead of a ship. Unlike depth charges, Hedgehog exploded only upon impact with a submarine hull, making it both safer for escorts and far deadlier for U-boats. Later, the British added Squid, a highly accurate, three-barreled mortar that fired in coordinated patterns guided by sonar readings. These weapons did not just threaten the submarine, they stripped it of the tactical advantage it once enjoyed. But technology alone could not turn the tide. What truly reshaped the Atlantic was the way Allied nations learned to work together. Britain, the United States, and Canada formed a network of shared intelligence and operational coordination that became one of the war's most quietly transformative achievements. British scientists shared radar innovations. American factories produced aircraft and escort ships in quantities the U-boat arm could never match. Canadian shipyards built corvettes, frigates that joined convoy protection. Training schools across the Commonwealth standardized anti-submarine tactics. A convoy departing Halifax might be protected by Canadian escorts initially, then handed off to British or American groups mid-ocean, all operating under shared procedures. The result was a force that adapted faster than the U-boats could counter. Escorts, once inexperienced and hesitant, became skilled hunters. Air patrols that once spotted nothing began to appear over the horizon with alarming regularity. And convoys that had once been loose gatherings of ships became tightly defended formations capable of withstanding sustained attacks. Life aboard Allied escort ships changed as dramatically as aboard the U-boats. Sailors trained for long hours, learning to interpret radar screens, operate sonar, and maneuver precisely in coordinated patterns. They grew accustomed to the harsh Atlantic, the storms, the cold, the endless hours on watch. Their work carried the same. Tension felt inside U-boats, waiting, listening, searching for signs of an enemy that could appear at any moment. The difference now was that they held tools that gave them a chance to strike back. For civilians following the war, especially older generations who had lived through the First World War, the reports were both sobering and hopeful. Newspapers described the dangers facing convoys, but also celebrated the growing skill of Allied escorts. Families in Britain, Canada, and America watched the situation with anxious interest, knowing that the supplies crossing the Atlantic fed their nations, fueled their industries, and supported millions of soldiers fighting overseas. Meanwhile, inside the U-boats, the sailors sensed the growing danger long before their commanders fully acknowledged it. They noticed how aircraft appeared farther from shore than before. They heard the sonar pings more frequently. They endured moments when their submarine was found and driven deep by coordinated attacks that seemed almost impossibly precise. The young men who had once seen the Atlantic as a vast battlefield now felt the ocean shrinking around them. Some commanders adapted quickly, adopting new tactics, diving earlier, reducing radio transmissions, taking routes farther north or south, and avoiding predictable patterns. But even these adjustments could not fully counter the technological net forming around them. For the first time since the war began, the Wolfpacks found themselves reacting rather than commanding the initiative. Across the Atlantic, Allied leaders and scientists understood their progress not as triumph, but as necessity. Every convoy that reached its destination strengthened the war effort. Every U-boat sunk or forced to retreat opened the path for more supplies, more troops, and more hope. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won through a single decisive moment, but through thousands of small victories, tiny innovations, and quiet nights spent learning, watching, and adjusting. By late 1942, the U-boat arm was facing opponents who understood their methods, tracked their movements, and deployed technologies that pierced their stealth. The era of easy success had ended. A new, far more complex phase of the Atlantic War had begun, one that would test both sides not just in skill, but in endurance. The Wolfpacks still sailed, they still attacked, but the ocean no longer favored them as it once had. And the men aboard those submarines sensed, even if they could not yet admit it, that the balance of power was shifting beneath the surface. Enigma falls. The code breakers at Bletchley Park, long before most sailors in the Atlantic understood why U-boats seemed to be appearing in the wrong places at the wrong times, long before commanders at sea began to feel that the enemy knew their moves almost too well, and long before Karl Donitz realized that something deeper than radar or sonar was tightening around the Wolfpacks. The war was already being shaped in rooms far from the ocean. These rooms were quiet, windowed, and filled not with officers or sailors, but with mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and men and women whose talents had rarely been linked to combat. The work they did required no rifles, no torpedoes, no engines, only paper, pencils, logic, and endurance. And yet what they accomplished would become one of the most decisive elements of the Battle of the Atlantic. At Bletchley Park, a Victorian estate in the English countryside, some of the most unconventional minds of the war gathered under strict secrecy. Many were young, some had never seen the sea, but all were united by a single task: breaking the German cryptographic systems that encoded their naval orders. At the heart of these codes lay Enigma, a machine of rotating wheels and electrical circuits capable of producing more than 1 trillion possible combinations. It had been designed so that, even if a message was intercepted, its meaning would remain hidden unless the receiver had the exact same machine set to the exact same configuration at the exact same time. When the war began, many believed Enigma to be unbreakable. Even the Germans placed such faith in it that they transmitted some of their most sensitive instructions with minimal caution. The U-boat fleet depended on Enigma for everything: patrol lines, rendezvous points, convoy sightings, operational changes. Each night, crews adjusted the wheels of their machines according to a secret key list, believing that this routine ensured absolute security. What the German Navy never fully realized was that their system had cracks not in the engineering, but in the assumptions upon which it depended. And at Bletchley Park, the codebreakers focused on those cracks with a determination equal to that of any combat unit in the field. Breaking Enigma was not a single moment of triumph. It was a long, exhausting struggle, fought through pattern recognition, educated guesses, captured materials, and the relentless work of people who slept in shifts and labored under pressure few could imagine. Early help came from the Polish Cipher Bureau, whose pre-war insights into Enigma provided the foundation upon which the British built. Later, captured codebooks, recovered weather reports, and seized machine components helped narrow the variables. But the true breakthrough came from the ability to automate the search for patterns. Machines called bombs, designed by Alan Turing and other brilliant engineers, tested possible Enigma settings at speeds no human could match. Even so, success required both technological innovation and human intuition. Every decoded message was a small victory. Every failure was a reminder of how much depended on their work. As 1941 turned into 1942, Bletchley Park began to read a growing number of German naval signals. These messages, once decrypted, were given a new code name: Ultra. Some of the earliest Ultra insights were small: a convoy's position here, a U-boat's refueling instruction there. But taken together, they created a picture of the U-boat war that had been impossible before. For the first time, Allied headquarters could see the broad sweeps of Donitz's strategy. They saw where patrol lines formed, how Wolfpacks shifted, how convoys were detected. They learned how U-boats communicated with one another, the pattern of their movements, the routes they preferred, and the areas where they felt safest. With this information, convoys could detour around danger, escorts could reinforce threatened sectors, aircraft could be directed to regions where U-boats concentrated. For the sailors on the convoys, this change happened invisibly. They did not know why their routes suddenly shifted. They did not know why certain areas seemed quieter, less haunted by torpedoes. They simply sailed on, sensing that the danger, though still very real, had begun to change shape. For the Prances, U-boat crews, the disappearance of easy targets felt mysterious. They believed convoys must be lucky, or their radios must be insufficient. Some commanders blamed weather, others suspected isolated intelligence leaks. But few imagined that the enemy could read their messages. The idea felt impossible. Their trust in Enigma was nearly absolute. At times, British commanders also struggled with the temptation to use Ultra too boldly. If a U-boat trap was avoided too precisely or too frequently, the Germans might suspect their codes were compromised. And so the Allies used the decrypted intelligence with careful discipline. They allowed certain battles to unfold naturally. They risked losses to avoid revealing the truth. It was a difficult balance, saving lives without erasing the advantage secrecy provided. As 1942 progressed, the value of Ultra became unmistakable. Convoys that would once have been surrounded by Wolfpacks now slipped through the Atlantic with fewer encounters. Escorts found U-boats they had no right to find by chance alone. At times, entire patrol lines seemed to waste fuel waiting in empty stretches of ocean, while convoys passed safely hundreds of miles away. Inside the U-boats, the sailors began noticing how often their hunts ended in frustration. A convoy reported by a contact boat vanished. A Wolfpack assembled at great effort found no targets. Boats sent to intercept distant shipping lanes arrived too late. Commanders wrote puzzled entries in their logs. Some suspected Allied aircraft had improved their reconnaissance. Others believed the enemy had discovered new evasive tactics. None guessed the real reason that the very messages they sent to coordinate their attacks were guiding their opponents instead. Not every Enigma setting fell immediately. The German Navy introduced new procedures, added extra wheels to their machines, and occasionally shifted their key lists to improve security. Each of these changes created temporary blackouts for the codebreakers, but Bletchley Park responded with new methods, new bombs, and renewed effort. At times, the struggle became truly desperate, with the fate of entire convoys resting on whether a particular setting could be broken in time. Yet the codebreakers, working through exhaustion, anxiety, and secrecy, pushed forward. By early 1943, the impact of Ultra was becoming impossible to ignore. Allied losses declined steadily. U-boat sinkings increased. Convoys crossed the ocean with stronger escort support and fewer surprises. The Wolfpacks found themselves reacting to the Allies rather than dictating the rhythm of battle. And still, the U-boats attacked, unaware that every message home carried a quiet shadow. The codebreakers themselves never saw the ocean battles their work influenced. Many of them learned only after the war how significant their contributions had been. Some carried the secrecy so heavily that even their families never knew their role. But the sailors who survived convoys, the escort captains who successfully shielded their charges, and the commanders who watched the tide turn, all owed part of their survival to the quiet minds in the quiet rooms of Bletchley Park. For the U-boat arm, Enigma's fall was not immediately visible. It was subtle, gradual, and hidden, but its effects were profound. The Wolfpacks were no longer striking blindly at a scattered enemy. They were striking at an enemy that could see the shape of their intentions before the torpedoes were even loaded. As the war moved toward its most critical years, the deep ocean did not simply grow more dangerous. It grew less predictable. The advantage that once belonged to the U-boats had begun to slip away, carried not by ships or aircraft alone, but by minds who fought a different kind of battle, a battle of thought, patience, and persistence, waged far from the waves the submariners knew so well. The sky closes in. Long-range aircraft arrive by early 1943. The ocean that had once felt open and forgiving to the U-boats began to feel tighter, narrower, and far less predictable. The change came not from the water, nor from the ships that crisscrossed it, but from above, from the steady, unmistakable presence of aircraft, whose engines could be heard long before they appeared, and whose silhouettes meant danger even in the calmest seas. In the early war years, submariners often looked to the sky and saw nothing confident that the air gap, the vast mid-Atlantic region beyond the reach of land-based planes, protected them. But as new technologies matured and new aircraft arrived, that wide gap began to close, reshaping the Battle of the Atlantic in ways that few U-boat crews fully anticipated. For many submariners, the first sign of change came quietly. On patrols where they once surfaced freely at night to charge batteries or travel at higher speed, they began noticing aircraft sooner and more often. At first, these sightings were rare enough to be dismissed as bad luck or coincidence. But as the months passed, the pattern grew unmistakable. Aircraft appeared farther from shore than ever before. Their approaches became faster, more confident, and more precise. Something in the rhythm of the ocean war had shifted. The key to this new threat lay in long-range aircraft machines like the consolidated B-24 Liberator, the PBY Catalina, the Short Sunderland, and later, the very long-range versions of the B-24 that could fly deeper into the Atlantic than any plane had before. These aircraft carried radar that could detect a submarine even in darkness or fog, spotlights capable of exposing a surfaced boat instantly, and weapons designed specifically for attacking targets that moved beneath the waves. To sailors who had once counted on night as their ally, the new reality felt unsettling. Submarines operated best on the surface, their diesel engines needed fresh air, and the speed they gained on the surface allowed them to reach distant patrol zones and close on convoys. But with aircraft roaming the skies above them, the simple act of surfacing became a calculated risk. Lookouts scanned the darkness for the faintest shadow. Commanders listened carefully to the wind, knowing that an aircraft approaching from the right angle might be overhead before anyone heard its engines. In the early months of 1943, many U-boat crews described the same eerie phenomenon, an aircraft appearing out of nowhere, its approach silent until the last moment, its presence revealed only by the sudden burst of a spotlight or the whistle of descending bombs. This new threat came from radar, particularly centimetric radar, which allowed aircraft to detect periscopes, snorkels, and even the small wakes left by a moving submarine. No amount of darkness, fog, or cloud could fully hide a U-boat anymore. The ocean had grown transparent. The lee light, a powerful spotlight mounted on some aircraft, added another layer of propos. Danger. Pilots approached using radar alone, then switched on the light at the last moment, flooding the night with a brilliant beam that exposed the submarine on the surface. Sailors who had trusted the secrecy of night found themselves suddenly illuminated, their boat outlined perfectly in the white circle of light as bombs or depth charges rained down. Survivors later recalled these moments with vivid clarity: the shock of light, the scramble to dive, the roar of engines overhead, and the violent explosions that followed. The arrival of long-range aircraft also changed the way escorts and patrols coordinated. Convoys no longer relied solely on destroyers or corvettes to detect submarines. Aircraft could sweep ahead, scout for danger, and attack before the convoy ever came into contact with a Wolfpack. U-boats waiting patiently in their patrol zones sometimes found convoys shifting routes unexpectedly, as aircraft provided reconnaissance that exposed submarine positions based on their radio transmissions or torpedo attacks. The air, once empty, had become an ever-present participant in the battle. For the German crews, this new threat altered daily routines as much as combat strategies. Surfacing to recharge batteries required careful timing. Nights, once used for speed and hunting, now required long periods, submerged or at periscope depth. The strain on crews increased. Sleep grew more fragmented. The constant need to look skyward added a tension that never fully dissipated. Men who had grown comfortable with the rhythm of the early war found themselves relearning how to judge danger, how to react to sudden alarms, and how to endure the long hours submerged with limited air and rising heat. The psychological toll of air attack was profound. A ship approaching on the surface could be seen, heard, and often avoided, but an aircraft could descend with almost no warning. Inside the submarine, the first sign of danger might be the commander shouting for a crash. Dive. Men threw themselves to their positions. Valves spun. Hatches slammed. The submarine angled downward sharply as engines strained to pull the boat below the waves before the bombs fell. The moments between the alarm and the detonation felt impossibly long and impossibly short at the same time. When a U-boat survived such an attack, the relief was immediate, but temporary. The crew checked for leaks, broken gauges, damaged batteries, or structural weaknesses caused by pressure. They listened carefully for the hum of aircraft circling above. Each second felt like an hour. The ocean, once a place where a submarine could vanish with ease, now held dangers at every depth. Even when a submarine escaped one attack, another aircraft might appear soon after. The reach of long-range patrols grew each month, their numbers increasing as Allied industrial capacity surged. American factories produced aircraft at speeds the U-boat arm could never match. The British Coastal Command expanded its fleet. Canada contributed more patrols, and Iceland, Newfoundland, Greenland, and later the Azores became bases that pushed air coverage deeper into the Atlantic. The last sanctuary for U-boats, the mid-Atlantic air gap, shrank steadily. At first, it was still a vast stretch of water where aircraft could not reach. Then it became a smaller region. Then it became a narrow corridor. Eventually, it disappeared entirely. Nowhere in the Atlantic could a submarine be certain it was beyond the reach of aircraft. For the U-boat command, these changes demanded new tactics. Some boats traveled submerged for longer periods, though this slowed their speed and reduced their ability to find convoys. Others adopted snorkels, devices that allowed diesel engines to operate, while the submarine remained just below the surface. But early models were unreliable and often revealed the boat's presence. Still others attempted to operate in areas where air coverage remained weaker, though these zones shrank quickly as Allied strength grew. None of these adjustments fully addressed the threat. The Wolfpacks could still launch attacks, but doing so carried new levels of risk. A boat on the surface, closing in for a night attack, now faced the possibility of surprise from above. Coordination between submarines grew more difficult when they had to limit radio use, and the rising number of aircraft meant that even successful attacks often ended with the submarines forced into long, tense dives to escape the inevitable retaliation. Sailors aboard U-boats began to sense that the nature of their war was changing forever. The ocean no longer felt like a place where they moved unseen. The sky, once a distant dome above the waves, now felt dangerously close, as though it were leaning down toward the water with searching eyes. The men spoke of aircraft with wary respect, recognizing that their adversaries had gained not only new tools, but new confidence. Yet despite the growing threat, the U-boat crews continued to sail. They believed in their mission, in their commanders, in their comrades, and in their boats. They adapted to the new dangers, sharpened their vigilance, and braced themselves for what lay ahead. But the truth was clear. The ocean was no longer theirs. The sky had become the deciding factor in the Atlantic War, and its arrival was the beginning of a turning point from which the Wolfpacks would never fully recover. Depth charges and survival in the deep. For every sailor who served aboard a U-boat, there were few experiences more unforgettable than the sound of depth charges falling through the water. Long before the explosions shook the submarine's hull, the crew could hear them dropping first, as faint metallic splashes on the surface, then as a series of muffled thumps growing steadily closer. Those sounds signaled a moment when the U-boat's greatest advantage, its ability to disappear beneath the waves, became its greatest vulnerability. In those tense minutes, the submarine was no longer the hunter, it was the hunted. By the time the Allies refined their sonar and radar systems in 1942 and 1943, depth charge attacks had become far more accurate than in the early war years. A submarine that once slipped away easily after firing its torpedoes now found itself pursued relentlessly by escorts trained to track every trace of its movement. What followed was a deadly contest between technology, nerve, and endurance. a battle not fought on open decks or with visible weapons, but inside steel walls filled with darkness, stale air, and the creaking tension of the deep. When a U-boat commander realized an escort had detected him, he ordered an immediate dive. The boat angled downward, plunging into the depths, with engines straining and ballast tanks flooding. Men grabbed onto pipes, bunks, or railings as the floor tilted beneath them. Loose equipment slid across the deck. The light dimmed slightly as the pressure increased. Even for seasoned sailors, the beginning of a crash dive carried a jolt of fear, though it was swallowed quickly by the discipline drilled into them from their first days of training. Once submerged, the U-boat commander aimed to reach a depth that balanced safety and maneuverability. Too shallow, and the boat remained within easy range of depth charges. Too deep, and the hull strained under enormous pressure. The creaking of steel at depth was not a sound anyone forgot. It reminded every man aboard that the ocean was not a quiet place. It was alive with weight, pressing in from every direction, testing the submarine's limits with steady, patient force. Inside the boat, the air grew thicker. Conversations dropped to whispers. Every movement became deliberate. The crew listened to the hydrophone operator, who sat with headphones pressed tightly against his ears, reporting the sounds of propellers above them, the pitch of their engines, the direction of their movement, the telltale rhythm that revealed whether a destroyer was circling or approaching directly. When the first depth charges hit the water, the crew felt the change immediately. The submarine rocked gently at first as the charges fell, but then came the explosions, violent, cracking shocks that slammed against the hull with terrifying power. Dust shook loose from pipes, valves rattled, light fixtures trembled. Even men gripping solid steel felt the vibration travel through their bones. The hull did not bend visibly, but the crew felt every shudder as if the boat itself had flinched. Depth charges rarely exploded directly against a submarine. Most detonated dozens of meters away, but underwater pressure traveled fast and hard. A charge set to explode at the correct depth could knock instruments off their brackets, damage batteries, crack pipes, or blind the crew with flying debris. In some cases, even nearby explosions caused flooding that forced a submarine to surface, helpless against waiting escorts. For the men inside the U-boat, these attacks created a kind of suspended reality. The world outside was nothing but sound and shock waves. Inside, everything depended on silence. Engines slowed or stopped entirely. Men breathed shallowly to keep the air from growing too thick and hot. Sweating in the rising temperature, they sat perfectly still, listening for signs that the escort was moving away or returning for another run. Destroyers often used a tactic called creeping attack, in which one ship held the submarine's position with sonar, while another approached quietly to drop charges. To the U-boat crew, this felt like an invisible stalker. No engine noise, no warning, just sudden explosions erupting around them. Other times, escorts released long patterns of charges, hoping to box the submarine in or force it to change course. Each tactic brought its own rhythm of fear: the anticipation, the shock, the waiting, and then the next round. In those hours, sailors found themselves confronting not only the enemy, but the limits of their own endurance. The air grew stale as carbon dioxide accumulated. Sweat dripped onto the metal floor. Thirst and nausea crept in. Some men prayed silently. Others focused on small tasks, tightening a valve, adjusting a gauge, cleaning up debris to keep themselves calm. The doctor, if one was aboard, moved quietly among the crew, reassuring those who trembled or went pale, offering what little comfort the conditions allowed. And amid all this, the commander had to make decisions with precision and nerve. A wrong turn could lead directly into a pattern of depth charges. A poorly timed maneuver could reveal the submarine's position. He listened carefully to the hydrophone operator, timed his movements between explosions, and shifted course subtly, hoping to confuse the escorts above. Some U-boat commanders used the ocean itself as an ally. Temperature layers, called thermoclines, could bend sonar waves and obscure the submarine's position. Skilled officers learned to guide their boats into these layers, using the natural structure of the sea to hide from their pursuers. But even these tactics offered no guarantees. Every moment submerged risked draining the batteries, depleting oxygen, or forcing the boat into depth ranges where the hull groaned under intolerable strain. Sometimes, the attacks lasted minutes. Other times, they stretched on for hours long, exhausting ordeals in which sleep, food, and comfort faded into distant thoughts. When the last explosions finally faded, the silence felt almost unreal. The commander waited, listening for the fading noise of escort propellers. Only when he was certain the danger had passed did he order the engines to full speed again, rising back toward shallower depths or surfacing to replenish air. For the crew, the relief of survival carried its own mixture of emotions. Some men laughed quietly out of sheer exhaustion. Others sat with their heads in their hands, letting the tension drain away slowly. A few felt trembling in their fingers that lasted long after the submarine returned to normal depth. They checked the hull, the pumps, the valves, the batteries, sometimes discovering leaks or damage that required immediate repairs. But the greatest relief was the simple fact of still being alive. These experiences left deep impressions that sailors carried for the rest of their lives. Many later spoke of depth charge attacks as moments when time seemed to stretch endlessly, when fear sharpened every sound and breath, and when the closeness of death felt unmistakable. Yet they also remembered the unity these moments forged, the quiet bravery of the crew, the steady voice of the commander, the knowledge that survival came not from luck alone, but from discipline and calm under pressure. As the Allies refined their tactics, these attacks became increasingly frequent and increasingly dangerous. The deep, once a sanctuary for the U-boats, grew contested. The ocean that had seemed so vast now felt almost claustrophobic, and the men who fought beneath its surface learned to live with the understanding that any patrol could become a test of endurance in the crushing depths. The Wolfpacks still sailed, they still attacked, they still followed their orders with courage and precision. But with every depth charge dropped, with every sonar ping that echoed through the hull, the balance of the Atlantic War shifted further. Survival in the deep was no longer a matter of slipping away. Unnoticed, it had become a battle of endurance against a foe growing stronger, more coordinated, and more relentless by the day. Black May, the turning point of 1943. By the spring of 1943, the war beneath the Atlantic waves had entered a phase unlike anything the U-boat arm had faced before. The change had been coming slowly, carried by new technologies, tighter convoy systems, and the shrinking of the ocean's once safe spaces. But in May 1943, all of these forces collided in a single, devastating moment. The month would later be known among submariners as Black May, a turning point so severe that the U-boat force never fully recovered from it. To those who survived, the memory of those weeks remained vivid, etched with loss, shock, and the sobering realization that the era of German dominance at sea had come to an abrupt end. The early months of 1943 still carried glimmers of hope for the U-boats. Successes continued sporadically. A few Wolfpacks achieved modest victories against isolated convoys. Commanders believed that with determination and tactical refinement, the Atlantic could still be contested. Donitz, who had risen to overall command of the Kriegsmarine after Admiral Raeder's departure, remained convinced that submarines were the key to defeating Britain's supply lines. He called for more boats, more aggressive action, and renewed pressure on the convoys that carried food, fuel, and war material across the ocean. But even as he pushed forward, the balance had shifted decisively against him. The Allies had refined every aspect of their defense: radar, sonar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, codebreaking, and improved convoy tactics had formed a unified system far stronger than the sum of its parts. The U-boats found themselves outmatched not by a single enemy, but by an entire network of coordinated efforts that grew sharper with each passing month. In April and early May, Donitz assembled several large Wolfpacks in the North Atlantic, hoping to strike a decisive blow. These groups, consisting of dozens of submarines, took positions along the convoy routes, forming long patrol lines that stretched across miles of ocean. The strategy was familiar: detect a convoy, attack with massed force, and overwhelm the escorts before they could respond effectively. But the Atlantic of 1943 was not the Atlantic of 1941. The ocean had become watched, patrolled, and mapped by a force that anticipated the U-boats in ways they could not yet grasp. The first signs of disaster appeared when Allied aircraft began detecting the Wolfpacks even before they located their targets. Centimetric radar allowed planes to spot submarines running on the surface from distances previously unimaginable. Aircraft dropped depth charges with stunning accuracy. Escort carriers brought air cover deep into the mid-ocean, eliminating the air gap the U-boats had once relied upon. Submarine commanders found themselves attacked at moments they once considered safe on the surface at night, during routine patrols, or while attempting to shadow convoys. As U-boats were forced to dive more frequently, their movements slowed. They needed to conserve battery power and avoid detection. Their ability to coordinate with one another diminished. Radio transmissions risked revealing their positions. Convoys slipped past patrol lines untouched, while aircraft forced the submarines deeper into defensive patterns. Then came the convoy battles of May, violent clashes that revealed just how much the tide had turned. Convoy ONS-5, a westbound group of slow merchant ships, became a defining moment. In late April, nearly 40 U-boats attempted to intercept it. In earlier years, such a force would have inflicted heavy losses, but ONS-5 was escorted by a mix of British, Canadian, and American ships equipped with improved radar, sonar, and weapons. Aircraft flew in support whenever weather permitted. The battle that unfolded was long, brutal, and symbolic of the changing war. The U-boats pressed in at night, seeking to break through the defenses. They fired torpedoes, attempted to approach on the surface, and used every tactic they had refined over years of warfare. But the escorts responded with unprecedented precision. Radar detected submarines miles away. Hedgehog mortars fired deadly patterns. Depth charge attacks were coordinated so tightly that several submarines were forced to surface, damaged beyond control, where they were destroyed by gunfire or scuttled by their crews. For the first time, the Wolfpacks suffered more losses than the convoy they attacked. ONS-5 lost a handful of ships, but the U-boats lost far more. When the battle ended, the convoy reached its destination largely intact, while the submariners returned to port shaken, exhausted, and increasingly aware of the impossible challenge ahead. Black May intensified from there. Convoy SC-130 repelled 2 major Wolfpack attacks with minimal damage. Convoy HX-239 traveled almost untouched under continuous air cover. Everywhere the U-boats turned, they found the Allies waiting. Aircraft spotted periscopes. Escorts chased submarines relentlessly. New tactics such as radar-guided Leelite attacks caught U-boats by surprise even in the darkest hours of night. In the span of a single month, the German Navy lost 41 U-boats. It was a scale of loss that stunned even the most seasoned commanders. The figure represented nearly 1/4 of the operational submarine force at sea. Many of the lost boats vanished without survivors. Others sent final messages that conveyed fear, confusion, and disbelief. Survivors who returned to their bases in France stepped ashore like men emerging from a nightmare, pale, shaken, and crowding into the fresh air, grateful simply to breathe freely again. Donitz faced a devastating reality. His carefully constructed submarine force, built patiently over years, expanded through relentless construction, and fortified by some of the most skilled commanders in the Kriegsmarine, had suffered a blow from which it might never recover. He had always known that losses were inevitable, but not at this scale, not with this speed. The vision of strangling Britain's supply lines now seemed distant. With so many boats lost and so many crews killed, the remaining submarines were withdrawn temporarily from the North Atlantic. For the first time since the war began, the U-boat arm effectively ceded control of the Central Ocean to the Allies. It was a moment of profound strategic significance. The Wolfpacks, once feared by every convoy, now retreated in the face of overwhelming odds. For the U-boat crews, Black May marked an emotional turning point. Many sailors had entered the service with confidence born from the early successes of the war. They had believed in their boats, their commanders, and their tactics. But the events of 1943 shattered that belief. They now faced a future where every patrol carried a growing sense of uncertainty. The ocean felt changed, no longer an arena of opportunity, but a vast, unforgiving expanse where danger lurked above and below. Veterans spoke later of a shift in mood that spread through the bases in France. The laughter that once filled the docks grew quieter. The confident strides of returning crews became slower, more contemplative. Men looked at the empty berths of lost comrades and felt the weight of their absence. The knowledge that survival had become increasingly unlikely settled deep in their minds. And yet, even in this dark moment, the U-boat arm did not collapse. The men continued to sail because duty required it, because their comrades had sailed before them, and because they believed that courage meant continuing the mission, even when the outcome seemed uncertain. They adjusted their tactics, prepared their boats, and returned to their patrols with the stoic discipline that had defined them from the beginning. But the truth was clear. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached a turning point. Black May marked the moment when the Wolfpacks lost their momentum, their advantage, and their aura of inevitability. From that point on, the U-boats would be fighting not for dominance, but for survival. The ocean, once a place of opportunity, had become a battlefield where the sky, the sea, and the convoy escorts worked together with relentless precision. And the men who sailed aboard the U-boats, brave, determined, and enduring, now faced a future in which every patrol carried the possibility of becoming their last. A fading force, the final years of the U-boat war. By the summer of 1943, the U-boat arm found itself in a position few could have imagined during the confident days of early victory. The ocean that once felt vast and full of opportunity had tightened around them. The air, once empty, now hummed with the constant presence of patrol aircraft. Convoys that had been scattered and vulnerable now sailed in tight formations, protected by escorts armed with technologies capable of reaching submarines at depths once considered safe. And in the harbors of France, repair crews and officers felt the shift in morale as sharply as the sailors themselves. The war beneath the waves had changed, and the U-boats, once the hunters of the Atlantic, were becoming the hunted. After the devastating losses of Black May, Donitz understood that the U-boat force could not continue as it had. He withdrew submarines temporarily from the Central Atlantic to evaluate tactics, introduce new equipment, and train crews in updated strategies. But the pressure of war allowed little time for reflection. Every day the U-boats remained in port was a day that Allied convoys crossed the ocean with less resistance. Germany needed to renew the submarine campaign, even if the conditions had become far more dangerous. Donitz placed increasing hope in new technologies. Among these was the snorkel, a device originally developed by the Dutch Navy and adapted for German use. It allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, drawing air through a tube and expelling exhaust in the same way. In theory, this meant a U-boat could remain underwater indefinitely, avoiding detection by aircraft. But in practice, early snorkel systems were unreliable. The tube vibrated violently in heavy 80s spear and 7 seas, making the entire boat shudder. When waves covered the snorkel head, the engines pulled air from within the boat, causing sudden pressure drops that made sailors' ears pop painfully. Carbon monoxide sometimes seeped back inside, leaving crews dizzy or nauseated. Still, the snorkel represented a step toward greater concealment, and commanders adopted it despite its flaws. At the same time, the Germans began producing new submarine types faster, quieter, more advanced. The most notable were the Type XXI boats, sometimes called electroboats, designed to operate primarily underwater rather than on the surface. They featured streamlined hulls, powerful batteries, and faster submerged speeds than anything the Allies possessed. In Donitz's vision, these new submarines would restore the U-boat arm's ability to challenge Allied shipping. But production delays, resource shortages, and frequent Allied bombing raids at shipyards slowed the program nearly to a halt. By the time a handful of Type XXI submarines entered service, the war was nearing its end. They were boats built for a conflict that had already passed. While new technologies struggled to reach the front, the U-boats at sea endured increasingly harsh conditions. Patrols grew longer as boats traveled farther to find convoys. Allied air coverage extended across nearly the entire ocean, forcing submarines to spend most of their time submerged. This created new challenges. Air inside the submarine grew stale, batteries drained quickly, speed dropped dramatically while underwater. Even locating convoys became difficult, since U-boats could not travel on the surface long enough to perform effective reconnaissance. The ocean itself seemed to turn against them. Crews described it as a place filled with unseen threats. Aircraft descended without warning. Radar signals pierced the darkness. Escort carriers sent planes far beyond the horizon. Every surfacing carried risk. Every dive carried stress. Even the sound of distant engines overhead could send a jolt through the entire crew. As losses increased, the composition of U-boat crews changed as well. Veterans who had survived multiple patrols were fewer. Younger men, some barely trained, took their places. They carried courage, but lacked experience. They learned under fire, often facing conditions far worse than those their predecessors had endured. Many would not return from their first patrol. Yet even in these dark years, the U-boat crews displayed a level of resilience that surprised those who studied the war later. They adapted to the new dangers with quiet discipline. They mastered the snorkel despite its flaws. They adjusted their tactics, avoiding heavily patrolled areas, traveling submerged for days at a time, and waiting patiently for opportunities. They trusted their commanders and worked together with the same camaraderie that had defined the U-boat service from the beginning. In the ports of France, however, the mood shifted dramatically. What had once been bustling bases filled with confidence became places marked by anxiety and fatigue. Each returning boat carried fewer men who had known the early successes of the war. Repairs took longer as Allied bombers targeted dock facilities. Supply shortages created delays. Officers walked the pens with heavy steps, wondering how many more patrols their boats could endure. As 1944 approached, the strategic balance worsened. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June cut off access to many French ports, forcing U-boats to operate from bases in Norway, Germany, and the remnants of occupied territory. The Bay of Biscay, once a dangerous but manageable gateway to the Atlantic, became a lethal corridor patrolled by aircraft day and night. U-boats attempting to escape found themselves attacked repeatedly before they even reached open water. Inside the submarines, the crews sensed the shift long before official reports confirmed it. They heard news from home through fragmented radio messages, cities bombed, friends conscripted, families displaced. They understood that the war on land was turning against Germany, and that their missions, already difficult, were becoming increasingly desperate. The pressure weighed on everyone, from the youngest sailor loading torpedoes to the commander making life-or-death decisions under relentless threat. Despite these realities, the U-boat arm continued to send boats to sea. Some managed isolated successes. A few convoys suffered losses, but these victories were overshadowed by the rising number of submarines that failed to return. The waters around Britain, the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Bay of Biscay became vast graveyards for steel hulls that never resurfaced. The emotional toll on the crews and their families was immense. Letters home were filled with reassurances few believed. Families waited months for word, often receiving only terse notifications that their loved one's boat was missing, presumed lost. Among the submariners, the bond between crewmates deepened further, strengthened by the shared knowledge that each patrol could be their last. For the survivors, the final years of the U-boat war were marked by a mixture of dedication, resignation, and resolve. They understood they were fighting in a conflict whose tide had turned. Many continued not out of hope for victory, but out of loyalty to their comrades, their duty, and the memories of those who had sailed before them. Donitz, despite the crushing losses, fought to sustain the U-boat campaign. He reorganized operations, pushed for new boats, and maintained strict discipline, but even he recognized that the window for success had closed. In private conversations and guarded communications, he acknowledged the overwhelming power the Allies now held. The Wolfpacks, once a symbol of Germany's maritime strength, were now scattered, weakened, and fighting against impossible odds. By early 1945, the U-boat force was a shadow of its former self. A few boats continued to sail, some achieving isolated feats of bravery, others disappearing into the cold waters without a trace. When Germany surrendered in May, Donitz, briefly the last leader of the collapsing Reich, ordered all remaining submarines to cease operations. The war in the Atlantic was over. For the U-boat crews who survived, the end arrived with a mixture of relief and sorrow. They had endured hardships few could imagine. They had lived in steel corridors beneath crushing pressure. They had faced aircraft, depth charges, hunger, fear, and exhaustion. And now, at last, the war that had shaped their youth was finished. The Wolfpack era had begun with confidence, risen to a peak of deadly effectiveness, and ended in quiet, somber recognition of the forces that had overwhelmed it. The ocean remained, vast and eternal, but the world that once sailed upon it had changed forever. Aftermath. What became of the Despies, crews and commanders? When the war finally ended in May 1945, the long struggle beneath the Atlantic waves drew to a quiet close. There were no parades for the surviving U-boat crews, no triumphant homecomings, no celebrations marking their return. Many of them stepped ashore into a world forever changed, carrying years of exhaustion in their shoulders and memories that would remain with them long after the guns fell silent. The men who had once formed the backbone of the U-boat arm now found themselves scattered across a defeated and fractured nation, each seeking to rebuild a life that had paused the moment they first boarded a submarine. For many sailors, the first challenge was simply returning home. Germany lay in ruins. Cities were shattered, roads broken, and families displaced. Trains ran sporadically, if at all. Food was scarce. Survivors often walked miles to find their way back to familiar towns, only to discover that homes had been destroyed or relatives had evacuated. The war had erased the stability that once greeted them when they returned from patrol. Now, instead of the familiar embrace of loved ones waiting at the quay, they stepped into a silence filled with uncertainty. Yet for all the hardship, there was also relief. The patrols were over. No longer would they brace for the sound of depth charges or strain their ears listening for aircraft. No longer would they endure long weeks in cramped quarters or feel the ceaseless pressure of the sea pressing in on all sides. The sheer act of breathing open air without fear, of seeing the sky unbroken by danger, brought a sense of calm that felt almost unreal. As one veteran later wrote, "The world felt wider than it had in years, and yet somehow emptier too." The emotional adjustment, however, proved far more difficult than the physical transition. Many submariners carried memories that lingered in ways they never spoke aloud. They had seen ships break apart in fire. They had heard the cries of men in lifeboats drifting behind them. They had felt their submarine shaken violently by explosions, believing in those moments that their lives were ending. These experiences left marks that time alone could not erase. Some sailors found solace in work, throwing themselves into rebuilding farms, factories, or small businesses. Others struggled with lingering fear or guilt, haunted by the tension and losses they had endured. Still, the camaraderie that had sustained them beneath the waves did not disappear. Former crewmen often sought one another after the war, forming small communities that offered understanding no one else could provide. They gathered quietly at cafes, in rebuilt homes, or at small local memorials, sharing stories in tones softened by age and distance. They did not boast of victories or dwell on the horrors. Instead, they spoke of the men who had not returned, the nights spent submerged in silence, and the strange mixture of pride and sorrow that defined their memories. Among the commanders, the aftermath carried its own complexities. Karl Donitz, who had risen to replace Hitler as the final leader of the collapsing German state, was captured by Allied forces and later tried at Nuremberg. He faced charges related to unrestricted submarine warfare policies that had been used by multiple nations in both world wars. The tribunal judged his conduct within the broader context of the regime he served, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. During his imprisonment, he wrote extensively, reflecting on strategy, leadership, and the heavy price paid by the men who sailed under his command. Other U-boat commanders faced different futures. Some were tried for specific wartime actions. Others returned home quietly, blending into civilian life with little fanfare. A few emigrated to other countries, seeking fresh beginnings far from the reminders of the conflict. Many lived modest lives, working in trade, industry, or agriculture. There, wartime experiences became private stories, shared only among those who understood the pressures of the Atlantic, men who could still recall the sounds of the hull creaking under deep pressure or the distant hum of destroyers hunting them. The fate of the U-boats themselves added another layer to the post-war landscape. Under the terms of Germany's surrender, all operational submarines were ordered to surface, hoist black flags, and proceed to Allied ports. There, crews were instructed to hand their vessels over intact. Allied sailors boarded the submarines, inspecting their equipment, technology, and the conditions in which the crews had lived. Many U-boats were later scuttled as part of Operation Deadlight, a post-war program to dispose of captured German submarines. They were towed into the Atlantic, stripped of valuable equipment, and sunk, some by naval gunfire, others by bombs or controlled flooding. Today, these wrecks lie in deep water off the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, silent reminders of a war that once raged intensely above them. For the families of the submariners, the aftermath brought its own form of shock. Some received long-awaited news that their sons, husbands, or brothers had survived. Others, after months or years of uncertainty, learned that their loved ones would never return. The war at sea had been particularly unforgiving. Many U-boats disappeared without trace, leaving families with no graves to visit and no final words to cherish. For those left behind, the mourning often lasted a lifetime. As the years passed, Germany rebuilt itself, and the memory of the U-boat war softened into history. Veterans aged, families grew. Streets, once marked by rubble, filled with new homes and businesses. And the U-boat crews, once feared by Allied sailors and celebrated by wartime propaganda, became part of a more complex narrative, one that balanced tactical innovation with human tragedy, courage with loss, and duty with reflection. Some veterans wrote memoirs, sharing their experiences with a world that was finally ready to listen with empathy rather than judgment. Many of these accounts revealed the deep humanity behind the iron silhouettes of the submarines, stories of friendship, fear, responsibility, and endurance. Others remained silent, choosing to carry their memories privately. But even in silence, the weight of their service remained. shaped by the knowledge that they had lived through something few could fully comprehend. In the decades that followed, historians, naval officers, and families revisited the story of the U-boat war with a more balanced understanding. Museums preserved artifacts. Wrecks were mapped by divers and researchers. Communities held commemorative events. And across nations that had once been divided by conflict, former enemies met in acts of reconciliation, honoring the shared experience of those who risked everything in the unforgiving battles of the sea. For the submariners themselves, the years after the war offered a chance to rebuild, reflect, and grow old among the memories of their youth. Some found peace, others continued to grapple with the ghosts of the deep, but all of them carried within them the lessons of a world reshaped by conflict, lessons of courage, duty, sacrifice, and the enduring human desire to find meaning in even the darkest chapters of history. Their story, once written in torpedoes and sonar echoes, became a story of survival and memory. And as time moved forward, the world gradually came to see the U-boat crews not just as participants in a vast and complex war, but as individuals, each with a life, a family, and a journey that extended far beyond the cold waters of the Atlantic. Wrecks in the deep, the U-boat graves of the Atlantic. Long after the war ended, and long after the surviving sailors returned home to rebuild their lives, the Atlantic kept its own memories hidden beneath the surface. Down in the cold, lightless depths lie the remains of hundreds of U-boats, steel hulls now softened by rust and marine growth, resting on the seabed like silent monuments to a war fought in darkness. These wrecks, scattered across the ocean floor from the Bay of Biscay to the Arctic Circle, form one of the largest graveyards of war in the world. And though the men who once served aboard them are gone or growing old, the submarines remain, watched only by currents, fish, and the passing shadows of whales. To understand these underwater graves is to understand both the enormity of the Battle of the Atlantic and the human cost it carried. Each wreck tells a story not of strategy or victory, but of the moment when a submarine's journey ended forever. Many boats were lost in storms, others in combat. Still others vanished without sending a final message. Some sank in violent explosions. Others slipped quietly beneath the waves, their fate unknown until decades later, when divers or sonar surveys rediscovered them. For decades after the war, these wrecks received little attention. The ocean was vast, technology limited, and the world preoccupied with rebuilding. But as sonar improved and underwater exploration matured, researchers began mapping the locations of lost U-boats. Oceanographers, naval historians, and deep-sea explorers slowly pieced together the fates of boats that had disappeared without explanation. Each discovery brought a mixture of scientific interest and somber reflection, as researchers realized that the ocean floor held not merely metal remains, but the final resting places of thousands of young men. One of the most haunting aspects of these wrecks is their stillness. In the deep ocean, where sunlight never reaches and temperatures hover just above freezing, time moves slowly. Steel corrodes, but gradually. Structures collapse, but only after decades. Many U-boats lie in remarkably preserved condition, their hulls intact, their conning towers still upright, their torpedo tubes facing outward as they did on their last patrol. Inside these boats, human stories linger in objects left behind: boots, mugs, charts, and occasionally personal items preserved by cold and pressure. Divers who visit shallower wrecks often speak of the emotion that surrounds them. The moment they descend and the silhouette of the submarine emerges from the blue-green darkness, the wartime world suddenly feels close again. Some divers describe a sense of reverence, others a quiet sadness. Many simply observe in silence, aware that the site is not merely a wreck, but a grave. Most countries treat U-boat wrecks as war graves, protected by international law, shielded from disturbance, and visited only by those who seek understanding rather than souvenirs. The deep-sea wrecks, those lying far below diving limits, reveal their stories instead through remote exploration. Submersibles and underwater drones capture images of twisted hulls, resting on mud plains or entangled in undersea canyons. Cameras glide through broken compartments where crew once lived, showing rusted valves, collapsed bunks, and walls suddenly exposed to the sea. In these silent rooms, time holds its breath. The sea preserves the memory of the men who never returned. As researchers explored more wrecks, patterns emerged that offered new insights into the final moments of the submarines. Some U-boats sank with their hatches sealed, suggesting the crew was still alive when the boat went down. Others showed signs of catastrophic explosions, torpedoes, or batteries igniting with a force that shattered the hull instantly. A few displayed evidence of collisions, mines, or depth charges striking close enough to tear open plates of steel. Each wreck became a chapter in the larger story of the Atlantic War, revealing truths once hidden by the fog of conflict. Families of lost crewmen sometimes found closure in these discoveries. For decades, many had lived with only a brief telegram stating that their loved one's boat was missing. No location, no explanation, only uncertainty. When researchers identified a wreck, matched its markings, and confirmed its identity, families finally received information they never expected. Some visited memorials, others sent letters of thanks. A few quietly lit candles, knowing at last where their sons, fathers, or brothers had come to rest. But even for those with no direct family ties, the U-boat graveyards hold a deeper meaning. They remind the modern world that the Battle of the Atlantic was not fought by faceless machines, but by people, men who lived in the cramped quarters of submarines, who shared meals, told stories, endured storms, and faced dangers that are difficult to imagine. The wrecks preserve these human stories in silence, untouched by politics or propaganda. The ocean does not honor victory or defeat. It holds only memory. Some of the most famous wrecks carry stories that resonate far beyond the war itself. The wreck of U-47, commanded by the legendary Gunther Prien, has never been found, leaving lingering questions about its fate. U-166 was discovered near the mouth of the Mississippi River, revealing details of a long, uncertain sinking. U-352, lying off the coast of North Carolina, became a popular dive site where generations of divers learned the history of the war beneath the Atlantic. Each wreck, whether widely known or quietly resting in anonymity, tells a story that bridges past and present. For marine biologists, the wrecks have taken on another unexpected role. Over time, U-boats have become artificial reefs, attracting fish, coral, and other marine life. In the stillness of the deep, where natural structures are scarce, these steel hulls provide shelter and surface for growth. A strange form of transformation occurs. What once was a weapon becomes a foundation for life. The ocean, in its endless cycle, reclaims everything and repurposes it in ways no one could have imagined during the war. Historians, too, find value in these underwater sites. They study the angles of damage, the positions of debris, and the structural changes to understand how U-boats fought and fell. Their work adds depth to the written records, offering new clarity to events once pieced together from scattered reports. For them, each wreck is a puzzle, a silent witness that speaks through its scars. As time continues its steady march, the U-boat graves remind us not only of the war's past, but of its lasting legacy. The men who sailed aboard these submarines lived through moments of intense fear, camaraderie, purpose, and uncertainty. Many were barely out of their teens. Others were experienced sailors who carried the weight of leadership. All became part of a story that continues to fascinate, not because of the machinery they operated, but because of the human strength and fragility that defined their lives. Today, when ships pass over the locations of these wrecks, the surface gives no hint of what lies below. The waves move, as they always have, restless, shifting, indifferent, but beneath them, Hundreds of steel shapes sleep in the cold embrace of the deep, untouched by sunlight, unchanged by seasons. They rest in the silence that follows war, a silence that speaks softly to those who pause long enough to listen. The ocean holds them gently now, far from the explosions and alarms that once echoed through their hulls. And in that quiet, they remind us that history never disappears. It settles, layer by layer, into the world around us, waiting to be rediscovered, remembered, and understood by those who come after. What the Wolfpack War taught the world. The story of the U-boat Wolfpacks is not only a chapter of naval warfare, it is a chapter of human learning, shaped by the successes, failures, innovations, and tragedies that unfolded across the Atlantic. When the war ended, nations on both sides of the conflict looked back at the submarine campaign with a mixture of solemn reflection and analytical clarity. What had begun as a contest of stealth and endurance became a lesson in cooperation, technology, intelligence, and resilience. The Wolfpack War offered insights that shaped not only submarine strategy in the decades that followed, but the broader understanding of how nations prepare for, fight, and survive long conflicts. One of the most lasting lessons was the power of coordination. The early successes of the Wolfpacks were not simply the result of aggressive tactics or skilled commanders. They came from the ability of multiple submarines to act as a single, unified force. Donitz had recognized early that lone submarines, acting independently, could not consistently inflict decisive damage. But a group of boats, communicating through brief, encrypted messages, could hunt with a precision that magnified their strength. Even when operating across hundreds of miles, the Wolfpacks could converge on a convoy, overwhelm its defenders, and strike from multiple angles. This concept of distributed but coordinated action became a foundation for future naval thinking. In the post-war era, navies around the world studied the Wolfpack tactics carefully, understanding that the strength of a fleet lay not only in its ships, but in the way they communicated and supported one another. Coordination could transform even small forces into formidable threats, and the U-boats had demonstrated that truth with dramatic clarity in the early war years. But the Wolfpack War also taught the world the limits of such coordination. As the Allies developed radar, sonar, codebreaking, escort carriers, and long-range aircraft, they created a counter-network more powerful than the Wolfpacks themselves. The submarine war revealed that no tactic, however successful, remains effective forever. Technology changes, enemies adapt, and strategies must evolve. This lesson became essential in the Cold War era, when submarine forces worldwide focused not on static doctrines but on constant innovation. Another profound lesson emerged from the importance of intelligence. The U-boats had relied heavily on the security of the Enigma machine. When that security was broken, though unknown to them, the foundation of their coordination weakened. The Allies' ability to read German communications, even intermittently, changed the war more than any single ship or weapon. Ultra-intelligence allowed convoys to alter their routes, forces to prepare defenses, and air patrols to intercept submarines before they found their targets. After the war, as details of Bletchley Park's work became public, nations worldwide recognized the significance of cryptography, signals intelligence, and information warfare. The submarine campaign became a case study in how battles are often won not solely on the front lines, but in the quiet rooms where analysts, mathematicians, and linguists work. Modern naval strategy still rests heavily on the lessons drawn from Ultra. Information is a weapon as vital as any torpedo. The U-boat war also highlighted the importance of industrial capacity. Early in the conflict, Germany's limited production of submarines constrained the Wolfpack strategy. Donitz repeatedly warned that he lacked the numbers needed for decisive victory. By contrast, the United States and Britain used their enormous industrial potential to build ships, aircraft, and escort vessels at a pace Germany could never match. This imbalance eventually overwhelmed the U-boats, no matter how skillful their crews. The lesson was clear. In prolonged wars, industrial strength often determines the outcome. In the years that followed, nations took these lessons to heart, investing in shipyards, manufacturing networks, and logistics systems that could sustain long campaigns. The Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated that wars are fought not only by soldiers and sailors, but by workers, engineers, welders, and factory laborers whose efforts keep fleets afloat and supplied. The Wolfpack era also shaped the evolution of submarine design. The U-boats of the early war years operated primarily on the surface, diving mainly to attack or evade. Their diesel-electric engines limited their submerged endurance. They lacked the streamlined shapes necessary for high underwater speed. But the pressures of the war and the innovations attempted too late by Germany pointed the way toward the submarines of the future. Post-war designs incorporated lessons from the Type XXI boats, emphasizing underwater performance, quieter engines, greater battery capacity, and eventually, nuclear propulsion. The submarines of the Cold War owed much to the hard-won lessons of the U-boat arm. Yet beyond technology and strategy, perhaps the deepest lessons of the Wolfpack War were human ones. The submariners themselves on both sides endured hardships that tested the limits of endurance. They lived in cramped quarters, faced the constant fear of depth charges, and navigated the tension of weeks spent underwater with the same few companions. Their experiences revealed much about the psychology of isolation, the bonds formed under extreme threat, and the ways people adapt to environments far removed from ordinary life. The Allies, too, learned about endurance, about escort crews who spent months at sea, braving storms and constant danger, and about merchant sailors who risked their lives to ensure food and supplies reached their destinations. The war at sea demonstrated the quiet heroism of those who worked without fanfare, often unnoticed by the broader war narrative, yet essential to its outcome. Another lesson came from the families who waited. The uncertainty faced by the loved ones of submariners, German, British, American, Canadian, revealed the emotional cost of prolonged conflict. They lived with the constant fear that a letter might arrive carrying the worst news. For many, that letter never came. Silence itself became the bearer of loss. Their experiences shaped post-war remembrance, fostering a deeper appreciation for the human cost of naval warfare. In later decades, former U-boat sailors met with Allied veterans in events marked not by bitterness, but by shared understanding. Their conversations often revealed a profound truth. The war had been fought not by monsters, but by young men placed in impossible situations, driven by duty, survival, and the belief that their actions mattered. Veterans who had once sought to destroy each other now shook hands, shared stories, and acknowledged the courage shown on both sides. These acts of reconciliation became some of the most meaningful legacies of the war beneath the waves. As time moved forward, historians and archaeologists continued exploring the wrecks, artifacts, and stories left behind. The U-boat campaign became a subject not only of military study, but of human reflection. Scholars examined how fear, resilience, leadership, and instinct shaped the actions of men in confined steel hulls. They studied the evolution of convoy systems, the interplay of technology and communication, and the ways nations learned from each other's innovations. For the modern world, the lesson was clear. The Wolfpack War was not simply a contest of machines or tactics. It was a demonstration of the complex interplay between technology, intelligence, industrial strength, and the human spirit. It showed how innovation can shift the balance of war, how courage can endure under unimaginable pressure, and how the ocean, vast and indifferent, shapes the fate of those who venture into it. Today, when one examines the history of submarine warfare, the Wolfpack era stands as both a remarkable achievement in coordination and a sobering reminder of war's brutal costs. It teaches not only what submarines can accomplish, but what must be remembered whenever nations find themselves tempted by conflict. that every tactic carries consequences, every victory carries loss, and every chapter of war carries lessons for the generations that follow. The story of the Wolfpacks taught the world much about how wars are fought. It taught even more about why they must be remembered. A last look at the Atlantic, legacy and reflection. In the quiet years after the war, when the oceans calmed and the great fleets returned to distant harbors, the Atlantic slowly reclaimed its ancient stillness. The waves washed over the routes where convoys once struggled through storms, and the wind drifted across waters where U-boats once prowled in silence. Time softened the traces of conflict, carrying away the echoes of engines, the flashes of explosions, and the long, tense nights when men on both sides waited for danger to break through the darkness. The story of the Wolfpacks settled into history not as a tale of victory or defeat alone, but as a powerful reminder of what humanity endures and what it learns when nations clash across vast distances. Beneath those waters now lie quiet forms of steel, covered in silt and coral, surrounded by fish moving gently through their rusted corridors. They rest not as weapons, but as memorials, holding within them the memory of the young men who once lived, hoped, and struggled inside their narrow hulls. For many who survived the war, the Atlantic remained a presence throughout their lives. They remembered the smell of the diesel engines, the creak of the hull at depth, the friendships formed in cramped quarters, and the strange mixture of fear and pride that carried them through each patrol. And as they aged, they spoke more softly about the past, less of tactics and strategy, more of the faces of comrades who never came home, and of the deep wish that such suffering would never again unfold upon the sea. The Allies, too, remembered the toll the ocean demanded. Merchant sailors who braved the convoys, escort crews who guarded them, and airmen who patrolled the skies carried their own scars, their own memories of nights spent searching for survivors or listening for the hum of unseen submarines. Their courage, like that of the U-boat crews, became part of the great tapestry of human endurance that shaped the modern world. And so the Atlantic, once a battleground, became once again simply an ocean, vast, cold, and eternal. It held its secrets gently, letting only fragments rise to the surface over the decades. A discovered wreck here, a recovered artifact there, and the stories told by aging veterans before their voices faded. Today, when we look back across the long arc of the U-boat war, we see not only the strategies or machines, but the people. We see young sailors pressing forward into uncertainty. We see families waiting for letters. We see scientists working late into the night to protect those at sea. We see, above all, the shared humanity that endured beneath the harshest conditions. The Wolfpacks are gone now. The convoys have scattered into memory. But the lessons, the reflections, and the quiet dignity of those who lived through that era remain. The ocean that witnessed their struggle now drifts peacefully under the sky, carrying their stories onward with the tides. You are listening to Lullaby of Empires, where history